Hello. How's everybody doing tonight? I mean, it doesn't look like people are really piling in just yet, so I guess I'll just do a little bit of talking to fill the air. I got my tea with me today. I actually did do something to make that honey I had not so solid so I could put it in my tea easier. I soaked it in some hot water, like the bottle, and it seemed like it turned out well, but now, for whatever reason, the honey is like kind of watery now. It's more like a sugar syrup now than like actual honey consistency. And I was worried that like some water had gotten in there, but I don't know if that's quite the case, because if water had gotten in, then some honey would have gotten out, and like all the water would have like, it would have looked like just that same amber color, but it didn't seem in that case, so I'm not quite sure what happened. But honestly, it's kind of easier to pour now, so I can't complain too much about that. You know, usually I make my tea about like half an hour before the stream starts, so right about now it's starting to finally reach a nice drinkable temperature. But once it gets too cold, I'll be able to put it on my mug warmer and everything will be fine. For some reason there's a little bit of phlegm in my throat. That's really interesting. Alright, so I guess I should probably do a little bit of a recap today. I mean, not like right now before I start. Basically last time we left off on the story here, Annie found out that Paul told Annie that he knew everything, and then Annie revealed that she had already known everything about him since like the beginning. So it's a bit of a strange situation we find ourselves in right now. So I guess without further ado, I will just go ahead and start reading. I mean, I'm not sure if there's like anyone watching, because I don't really pay attention to those kind of numbers anymore, but I guess we'll just get right into it. I mean, there's always time for like, people can always watch the VOD later. That's perfectly alright. Alright. How many times were you out in all? The knife. Oh Christ, the knife. Twice. No, wait. I went out again yesterday afternoon, around 5 o'clock, to fill up my water pitcher. This was true. He had filled the pitcher. But he had omitted the real reason for his third trip. The real reason was under his mattress. The Princess and the Pea. Polly and the Pig sticker. 3 times, counting the trip for water. Tell the truth, Paul. Just 3 times, I swear. I never to get away. For Christ's sake, I'm writing a book here, in case you didn't notice. Don't use the Savior's name in vain, Paul. You quit using mine that way, and maybe I will. The first time I was in so much pain that it felt like someone had put me into hell from the knees on down. And someone did. You did, Annie. Shut up, Paul. The second time, I just wanted to get something to eat, and make sure I had some extra supplies in here, in case you were gone a long time. He went on, ignoring her. Then I got thirsty. That's all there is. No big conspiracy. You didn't try the telephone either time, I suppose. Or took at the locks, because you're just such a good little boy. Sure, I tried the phone. Sure, I looked at the locks. Not that I would have gotten very far in the mud bath out there, even if your doors had been wide open. The dope was coming in heavier and heavier waves, and now he had just wished she would shut up and go away. She had already doped him enough to tell the truth. He was afraid he would have to pay the consequences in time. But first, he wanted to sleep. How many times did you go out? I told you. How many times? Her voice was rising. Tell the truth. I am. 3 times. How many times, goddammit? In spite of the cruiser load of dope she'd shot into him, Paul began to be frightened. At least if she does something to me, it can't hurt too much. And she wants me to finish the book. She said so. You're treating me like a fool. He noticed how shiny her skin was, like some sort of polymer plastic stretched tightly over stone. There seemed to be no pores at all in that face. Annie, I swear. Oh, liars can swear. Liars love to swear. Well, go ahead and treat me like a fool if that's what you want. That's fine. Goody goody for you. Treat a woman who isn't a fool as if she were, and that woman always comes out ahead. Let me tell you, Paul, I've stretched thread and strands of hair from my own head all over this house and have found many of them snapped later on. Snapped or entirely gone. Just disappeared. Poof. Not just on my scrapbook, but in this hallway and across my dresser drawers upstairs, in the shed, all over. Annie, how could I possibly get out in the shed with all those locks on the kitchen door? He wanted to ask. But she gave him no time, only plunged on. Now you go right ahead and keep telling me it was only 3 times, Mr. Smart Guy, and I'll tell you who the fool is. He stared at her, groggy but appalled. He didn't know how to answer her. It was so paranoid, so crazy. My God, he thought, suddenly forgetting the shed. Upstairs? Did she say upstairs? Annie, how in God's name could I get upstairs? Oh, right, she cried, her voice cracking. Oh, sure, I came in here a few days ago, and you'd managed to get into your wheelchair all by yourself. If you could do that, you could get upstairs. You could crawl. Yes, on my broken legs and my shattered knee, he said. Again, that black look of crevasse. The batty darkness under the meadow. Annie Wilkes was gone. The Burqa bee goddess was here. You don't want to be smart to me, Paul, she whispered. Well, Annie, one of us has to at least try, and you're not doing a very good job. If you just try to see how many times? 3. The first time to get medication. Yes, Novril capsules. And the second time to get food. That's right. The third time it was to fill up the pitcher. Yes, Annie. I'm so dizzy. You filled it up the bathroom. You filled it in the bathroom up in the hall. Yes. Once for medication, once for food, and once for water. Yes, I told you. He tried to yell, but what came out was a strengthless croak. She reached into her skirt pocket again and brought out the butcher knife. Its keen blade glimmered in the brightening morning light. She suddenly twisted to the left and threw the knife. She threw it with the deadly, half-casual grace of a carnival performer. It stuck, quivering, in the plaster below the picture of the Arc de Triomphe. I investigated under your mattress a little before I gave you your pre-op shot. I expected to find capsules. The knife was a complete surprise. I almost cut myself. But you didn't put it there, did you? He didn't reply. His mind was spinning and diving like an out-of-control amusement park ride. Pre-op shot? Was that what she had said? Pre-op? He was suddenly, utterly sure that she meant to pull the knife from the wall and castrate him with it. No, you didn't put it there. You went out once for medication, once for food, and once for water. This knife must have... Why, it must have floated in there and slid under there all by itself. Yes, that's what must have happened. Annie shrieked derisive laughter. Pre-op? Dear God, is that what she said? Damn you, she cried. God damn you, how many times? All right. I got the knife when I went out. I got the knife when I went after the water, I confess. If you think that means I was out any number of times, go on and fill in the blank. If you want it to be 5 times, it was 5. If you want it to be 20 or 50 or 100, that's what it was. I'll admit it. However many times you think, Annie, that's how many times I was out. For a moment, in his anger and dopey befuddlement, he had lost sight of the hazy, frightening concept inherent in that phrase, pre-op shot. He wanted to tell her so much. Wanted to tell her, even though he knew that a ravening paranoid like Annie would reject what was so obvious. It had been damp. Scotch tape did not like the damp. In many cases, her Ludlam-esque little traps had undoubtedly just peeled off and floated away on some random draft. And the rats, with a lot of water in the cellar, and the mistress of the manor gone, he had heard them in the walls. Of course, they had the run of the house, and they would be attracted by all the oogie stuff Annie had left around. The rats were probably the gremlins who had broken most of Annie's threads, but she would only push such ideas away. In her mind, he was almost ready to run the New York Marathon. Annie, what did you mean when you said you gave me a pre-op shot? But Annie was still fixated on the other matter. I said it was 7, she said softly. At least 7. Was it 7? If you want it to be 7, it was 7. What did you mean when you said... I can see you mean to be stubborn, she said. I guess fellows like you must get so used to lying for a living that you just can't stop doing it in real life. But that's alright, Paul. Because the principle doesn't change if you were out 7 times, or 70, or 70 times 7. The principle doesn't change, and neither does the response. He was floating away. He closed his eyes and heard her speak as if from a long distance away. Like a supernatural voice from a cloud. Goddess, he thought. Have you ever read about the early days at the Kimberley Diamond Mines, Paul? I wrote the book on that one, he said for no reason at all, and laughed. Pre-op? Pre-op shot? Sometimes the native workers stole diamonds. They wrapped them in leaves and poked them up their rectums. If they got away from the big hole without being discovered, they would run. And do you know what the British did to them if they got caught before they could get over Orange Riviere and into Boer country? I don't know how to pronounce that. Killed them, I suppose, he said, eyes still closed. Oh no, that would have been like junking an expensive car just because of a broken spring. If they caught them, they just made sure that they could go on working. But they also made sure they would never run again. The operation was called hobbling, Paul. And that is what I'm going to do to you. For my own safety, and yours as well. Believe me, you need to be protected from yourself. Just remember, a little pain, and it'll be over. Try to hold that thought. Terror sharp as a gust of wind filled with razor blades blew through the dope and Paul's eyes flew open. She had risen and now drew the bedclothes down, exposing his twisted legs and bare feet. No, he said. No, Annie. Whatever it is you've got on your mind, we can talk about it, can't we? Please? She bent over. When she straightened up, she was holding the axe from the shed in one hand and a propane torch in the other. The blade of the axe gleamed. Written on the side of the propane torch was the word Burns-O-Matic. She bent down again and this time came up with a dark bottle and the box of matches. There was a label on the dark bottle. Written on the label was the word betadine. He never forgot those things. He never forgot these things, these words, these names. Annie, no, he screamed. Annie, I'll stay right here. I won't even get out of bed. Please. Oh God, please don't cut me. It'll be all right, she said, and her face now had that slack, unplugged look. That look of perplexed vacuity. And before his mind was completely consumed in a forest fire of panic, He understood that when this was over, she would have only the vaguest memories of what she had done. As she had only the vaguest memories of killing the children and the old people and the terminal patients and Andrew Pomeroy. After all, this was the woman who, although she had gotten her cap in 1966, had told him only minutes ago that she had been a nurse for 10 years. She'd killed Pomeroy with that same axe. I know she did. He continued to shriek and plead, but his words had become inarticulate babble. He tried to turn away from her, and his legs cried out. He tried to draw them up, make them less vulnerable, less of a target, and his knees screamed. "Only a minute more, Paul," she said, and uncapped the betadine. She poured a brownish red muck over his left ankle. "Only a minute more and it's over." She tipped the blade of the axe flat, the tendons standing out on her strong right wrist, and he could see the wink of the amethyst ring she still wore on the pinky finger of that hand. She poured betadine on the blade. He could smell it, a doctor's office smell. That smell meant you were going to get a shot. "Just a little pain, Paul. It won't be bad." She turned the axe over and splashed the other side of the blade. He could see random flowers of rust blooming on this side before the goop covered it. Annie, oh God, please, no more. Don't, Annie, I swear to you, I'll be good. I swear to God, I'll be good. Please, give me a chance to be good. Oh, Annie, please let me be good. "Just a little pain. Then this nasty business will be behind us for good, Paul." She tossed the open bottle of betadine over her shoulder, her face blank and empty, and yet so unarguably solid. She slid her right hand down the handle of the axe almost to the steel head. She gripped the handle farther up in her left hand and spread her legs like a logger. "Annie, oh please don't hurt me." Her eyes were mild and drifting. "Don't worry," she said. "I'm a trained nurse." The axe came whistling down and buried itself in Paul Sheldon's left leg just above the ankle. Pain exploded up his body in a gigantic bolt. Dark red blood splattered across her face like Indian war paint. It splattered the wall. He heard the blade squeal against bone as she wrenched it free. He looked unbelievingly down at himself. The sheet was turning red. He saw his toes wriggling. Then he saw her raising the dripping axe again. Her hair had fallen free of its pins and hung around her blank face. He tried to pull back in spite of the pain in his leg and knee, and realized that his leg was moving, but his foot wasn't. All he was doing was widening the axe slash, making it open like a mouth. He had time enough to realize his foot was now only held on his leg by the meat of his calf, before the blade came down again, directly into the gash, sheared through the rest of his leg and burying itself deep in the mattress. Springs boinked and squoinked. Annie pulled the axe free and tossed it aside absently at the jetting stump for a moment. I guess staring absently, they forgot the word. Staring absently at the jetting stump for a moment, and picked up the box of matches. She lit one. Then she picked up the propane torch with the word Burns-O-Matic on it, and twisted the valve on the side. The torch hissed. Blood poured from the place where he no longer was. Annie held the match delicately under the nozzle of the Burns-O-Matic. There was a floof sound. A long yellow flame appeared. Annie adjusted it to a hard blue line of fire. "Can't suture," she said. "No time. Tourniquet's no good. No central pressure point. Gotta rinse. Cauterize." She bent. Paul screamed as fire splashed over the raw, bleeding stump. Smoke drifted up. It smelled sweet. He and his first wife had honeymooned on Maui. There had been a luau. The smell reminded him of the smell of the pig when they brought it out in the pit where it had cooked all day. The pig had been on a stick, sagging, black, falling apart. The pain was screaming. He was screaming. "Almost over," she said, and turned the valve. And now the ground sheet caught fire around the stump that was no longer bleeding, the stump that was as black as the pig's hide had been when they brought it out of. Eileen had turned away, but Paul had watched, fascinated, as they pulled off the pig's crackling skin as easily as you might skim off a sweater after a football game. "Almost over." She turned the torch off. His leg lay in a line of flames with his severed foot wavering beyond it. She bent and now came up with his old friend, the yellow floor bucket. She dumped it over the flames. He was screaming, screaming. The pain, the goddess, the pain. Oh, Africa. She stood looking at him, at the darkening bloody sheets with vague consternation. Her face was the face of a woman who hears on the radio that an earthquake has killed 10,000 people in Pakistan or Turkey. "You'll be all right, Paul," she said, but her voice was suddenly frightened. Her eyes began to dart aimlessly around as they had when it seemed that the fire of his burning book might get out of control. They suddenly fixed on something, almost with relief. "I'll just get rid of the trash." She picked up his foot. Its toes were still spasming. She carried it across the room. By the time she got to the door, they had stopped moving. He could see a scar on the instep, and remember how he had gotten that, how he had stepped on a piece of bottle when he was just a kid. Had that been at Revere Beach? Yes, he thought it had been. He remembered he had cried, and his father had told him it was just a little cut. His father had told him to stop acting like someone had cut his goddamn foot off. Then he paused at the door and looked back at Paul, who shrieked and writhed in the charred and blood-soaked bed, his face a deathly fading white. "Now you're hobbled," she said, "and don't you blame me. It's your own fault." She went out. So did Paul. Man, we're already starting out on like a very graphic, strong note, it seems. I don't know why, but there's like a little bit of phlegm in my throat, and it's kind of like messing with my voice. Yeah, I hope that goes away. The cloud was back. Paul dived for it, not caring if the cloud meant death instead of unconsciousness this time. He almost hoped it did. Just no pain, please. No memories, no pain, no horror, no Annie Wilkes. He dived for the cloud, dived into the cloud, dimly hearing the sounds of his own shrieks and smelling his own cooked meat. As his thoughts faded, he thought, "Goddess, kill you. Goddess, kill you. Goddess." Then there was nothing but nothing. Part 3. Paul. It's no good. I've been trying to sleep for the last half hour and I can't. Writing here is a sort of drug. It's the only thing I look forward to. This afternoon I read what I wrote, and it seemed vivid. I know it seems vivid because my imagination fills in all the bits another person wouldn't understand. I mean, it's vanity. But it seems the sort of magic, and I just can't live in this present. I would go mad if I did. A quote by John Fowles. "Oh, blessed Jesus, and it made a convulsive movement forward. Joffrey grasped his friend's arm. The steady beat of the drums pulsed at his head like something heard delirium. Bees drew around them, but paused. They simply flew past and it to the clearing as if by which Joffrey sickly. I guess it's like an excerpt of the book, but like a bunch of characters are missing. Paul picked up the typewriter and shook it. After a tune, a small piece of steel fell out onto the board across the arms of the wheelchair. He picked it up and looked at it. It was the letter T. The typewriter had just thrown its T. He thought, I'm going to complain to the management. I'm going to not just ask for a new typewriter, but fucking demand one. She got the money. She's got the money. I know she does. Maybe it's squirreled away in fruit jars under the barn, or maybe it's stuffed in the walls at her laughing place. But she's got the dough. And T, my God, the second most common letter in the English language. Of course he would ask Annie for nothing, much less demand. Once there had been a man who would at least have asked. A man who had been in a great deal more pain. A man who had had nothing to hold on to, not even his shitty book. That man would have asked, hurt or not. That man had the guts to at least try to stand up to Annie Wilkes. He had been that man, and he supposed he ought to be ashamed. But that man had had two big advantages over this one. That man still had 2 feet and 2 thumbs. Paul sat reflectively for a moment, reread the last line, mentally filling in the omissions, and then simply went back to work. Better that way. Better not to ask. Better not to provoke. Outside his window, bees buzzed. It was the first day of summer. Yeah, I guess that's kind of the point. I was trying to make it sound like my mic was cutting out. My tea is starting to get cold. Time to put on the tea warmer. Hell yeah. Had been. Let me go, Ian snarled, and turned on Joffrey, his right hand curling into a fist. His eyes bulged madly from his livid face, and he seemed totally unaware of who was holding him back from his darling. Joffrey realized with cold certainty that what they had seen when Hezekiah pulled the protective screen of bushes aside had come very close to driving Ian mad. He still tottered on the brink, and the slightest push would send him over. If that happened, he would take misery with him. Ian, let me go, I say. Ian pulled backwards with furious strength, and Hezekiah moaned fearfully. No, boss. Make them bees crazy. Them sting, Mizwe. Ian seemed not to hear. Eyes wild and blank, he lashed out at Joffrey, striking his old friend high on the cheekbone. Black stars rocketed through Joffrey's head. In spite of them, he saw Hezekiah beginning to swing the potentially dead Gosha. Or Gosha? A sandbag the Borkas favored for close work. In time to hiss, "No, let me handle this." Reluctantly, Hezekiah allowed the Gosha to subside to the end of its leather string like a slowing pendulum. Then Joffrey's head was rocketed back by a fresh blow. This one mashed his lips back against his teeth, and he felt the warm, salt-sweet taste of blood begin to seep into his mouth. There was a rough purring sound as Ian's dress shirt, now sun-faded and already torn in a dozen places, began to come apart in Joffrey's grasp. In another moment he would be free. Joffrey realized with dazed wonder that it was the same shirt Ian had worn to the Baron and Baroness's dinner party 3 nights ago. Of course it was. There had been no opportunity to change since then. Not for Ian, not for any of them. Only 3 nights ago. But the shirt looked as if Ian had been wearing it for at least 3 years. And Joffrey felt as if at least 300 had passed since the party. Only 3 nights ago, he thought again with stupid wonder. And then Ian was raining blows into his face. Let me go, damn you. Ian drove his bloody fist into Joffrey's face again and again. His friend for whom, in his right mind, he would have died. Do you want to demonstrate your love for her by killing her? Joffrey asked quietly. If you want me to do that, then by all means, old boy, knock me senseless. Ian's fist hesitated. Something at least approximating sense came back into his terrified, maddened gaze. I must go to her, he murmured like a man in a dream. I'm sorry I hit you, Joffrey. Truly sorry, my dear old man. And I'm sure you know it. But I must. You see her. He looked again, as if to confirm the dreadfulness of the sight, and again made as if to rush to where Misery had been tied to a post in a jungle clearing, her arms over her head. Glimmering on her wrists and fastening her to the lowest branch of the eucalyptus, which was the only tree in the clearing, was something the Borkas had apparently taken a fancy to before sending Baron Heidzig into the mouth of the idol and to his undoubtedly terrible death, the Baron's blued steel handcuffs. This time it was Hezekiah who grabbed Ethan, but the bushes rustled again and Joffrey looked into the clearing, his breath momentarily catching in his throat, as a bit of fabric may catch on a thorn. He felt like a man who must walk up a rocky hill with a load of decayed and dangerously volatile explosives in his arms. One sting, he thought. Just one and it's all over for her. No, boss mussin', Hezekiah was saying with a kind of terrified patience. It like the boss be saying, if you go out there, the bees wake up from dead dream, and if the bees wake, it don't matter for her if she be dying of one sting or 1 to 1,000 sting. If the bees wake up from dead dream, we all die, but she die first, and the most horrible. Little by little, Ian relaxed between the two men, one of them black, the other white. His head turned toward the clearing with dreadful reluctance, as if he did not wish to look and yet could not forbear to. Then what are we to do? What are we to do for my poor darling? I don't know, came to Joffrey's lips, and in his own state of terrible distress, he was barely able to bite them back. Not for the first time it occurred to him that Ian's possession of the woman Joffrey loved just as dearly, if secretly, allowed Ian to indulge in an odd sort of selfishness and an almost womanly hysteria that Joffrey himself must forego. After all, to the rest of the world, he was only Misery's friend. Yes, just her friend, he thought with half-hysterical irony. And then his own eyes were drawn back to the clearing, to his friend. Misery wore not a stitch of clothing, yet Joffrey thought that even the most prudish church thrice-a-week village biddy could not have faulted her for indecency. The hypothetical old prude might have run screaming from the sight of Misery, but her screams would have been caused by terror and revulsion, rather than outraged propriety. Misery wore not a stitch of clothing, but she was far from naked. She was dressed in bees. From the tips of her toes to the crown of her chestnut hair, she was dressed in bees. She seemed almost to be wearing some strange nun's habit. Strange because it moved and undulated across the swells of her breasts and hips, and even though there was not even a ghost of a breeze. Likewise, her face seemed encased in a wimple of almost Mohammedan modesty. Only her blue eye appeared out of the mask of bees which crawled sluggishly over her face, hiding mouth and nose and chin and brows. More bees, giant Africa browns, the most poisonous and bad-tempered bees in all the world, crawled back and forth over the steel bracelets before joining the living gloves on Misery's hands. As Joffrey watched, more and more bees flew into the clearing from all points of the compass. Yet it was clear to him, even in his current distraction, that most of them were coming from the west, where the great dark stone face of the goddess loomed. The drums pulsed their steady rhythm, in its way as much as soporific as the sleepy drone of the bees. But Joffrey knew how deceptive that sleepiness was, had seen what happened to the Baroness, and only thanked God that Ian had been spared that. And the sound of that sleepy hum suddenly rising to a furious buzzsaw squeal, a sound which had at first muffled and then drowned the woman's agonized, dying screams. She had been a vain and foolish creature, dangerous as well. She had almost gotten them killed when she had freed Stringfellow's bushmaster. But silly or not, foolish or not, dangerous or not, no man or a woman deserved to die like that. In his mind, Joffrey echoed Ian's question. What are we going to do? What are we to do for our poor darling? Hezekiah said, Nothing can do now, boss, but she is in no danger. As long as the drums they beat, the bees will sleep, and Mistress, she is going to sleep too. Now the bees covering her in a thick and moving blanket. Her eyes, open but unseeing, seemed to be receding into a living cave of crawling, stumbling, droning bees. And if the drums stop? Joffrey asked in a low, almost strengthless voice. And just then the drums did. For a moment, it's just... You see what I did there? It seems like the typewriter's going out again. How curious. Yeah, I actually gotta mute again because there's like some something in the back of my throat and I really need to like clear my throat, like do a really like thorough job of it, but I don't want to like peak the mic, so I'm just gonna mute for a second. Okay, I think that's better. Let me take a sip. Oh, let's see. Paul looked unbelievingly at the last line, then picked the royal up. He had gone on lifting it like some weird barbell when she was out of the room, God knew why, and shook it again. The keys clattered, and then another chunk of metal fell out on the board which served as his desk. Outside he could hear the roaring sound of Annie's bright blue riding lawnmower. She was around front, giving the grass a good trim so those cockadoodle Roydmans wouldn't have anything to talk about in town. He set the typewriter down, then rocked it up so he could fish out his new surprise. He looked at it in the strong late afternoon sunlight, slanting in through the window. His expression of disbelief never altered. Printed and raised in slightly ink-stained metal on the head of the key was E. Just to add to the fun, the old royal had now thrown the most frequently used letter in the English language. Paul looked at the calendar. The picture was of a flowered meadow, and the month said May, but Paul kept his own dates now on a piece of scrap paper, and according to his homemade calendar, it was June 21st. Roll out those lazy, hazy, crazy days of summer, he thought sourly, and threw the key hammer in the general direction of the wastebasket. Well, what do I do now, he thought. But of course, he knew what came next. Longhand. That was what came next. But not now. Although he had been tearing along like house afire a few seconds ago, anxious to get Ian and Joffrey and the ever-amusing Hezekiah caught in the Borka's ambush, so that the entire party could be transported to the caves behind the face of the idol for a rousing finale. He was suddenly tired. The hole in the paper had closed with an adamant bang. Tomorrow. He would go to Longhand tomorrow. Fuck Longhand. Complain to the management, Paul. But he would do no such thing. Annie had gotten too weird. He listened to the monotonous snarl of the riding lawnmower, saw her shadow, and, as so often happened when he thought of how weird Annie was getting, His mind recalled the image of the axe rising, then falling. The image of her horrid, impassive, deadly face, splattered with his blood. It was clear. Every word she had spoken, every word he had screamed, the squeal of the axe pulling away from the severed bone, the blood on the wall, all crystal clear. And as he also so often did, he tried to block this memory, and found himself a second too late. Because the crucial plot twist of Fast Cars concerned Tony Bonicero's near-fatal crack-up in his last desperate effort to escape the police. And this led to the epilogue, which consisted of the bruising interrogation conducted by the late Lieutenant Gray's partner in Tony's hospital room. Paul had interviewed a number of crash victims. He had heard the same thing time and time again. It came in different wrappers, but it always boiled down to the same thing. I remember getting into the car, and I remember waking up here. Everything else is a blank. Why couldn't that have happened to him? Because writers remember everything, Paul. Especially the hurts. Strip a writer to the buff, point to the scars, and he'll tell you the story of each small one. From the big ones you get novels, not amnesia. A little talent is a nice thing to have if you want to be a writer, but the only real requirement is that ability to remember the story of every scar. Art consists to the persistence of memory. Who had said that? Thomas Saz? William Faulkner? Cyndi Lauper? But that last name brought its own association. A painful and unhappy one under these circumstances. A memory of Cyndi Lauper hiccuping her way cheerfully through Girls Just Wanna Have Fun. It was so clear it was almost auditory. Oh, daddy dear, you're still number one. The girls, they wanna have fun. Oh, when the working day is done, yeah, girls just wanna have fun. Suddenly he wanted a hit of rock and roll worse than he had ever wanted a cigarette. It didn't have to be Cyndi Lauper. Anyone would do. Jesus Christ, Ted Nugent would be just fine. The axe coming down. The whisper of the axe. Don't think about it. But that was stupid. He kept telling himself not to think about it, knowing all the while that it was there, like a bone in his throat. Was he going to let it stay there, or was he going to be a man and stick the fucking thing up? Another memory came then. It seemed like this was an all-request oldies day for Paul Sheldon. This one was of Oliver Reed, as the mad but silkily persuasive scientist in David Cronenberg's movie The Brood. Reed urging his patients at the Institute of Psychoplasmatics, a name Paul had found deliciously funny, to go through with it. Go all the way through it. Well, maybe sometimes that wasn't such bad advice. I went through it once. That was enough. Bullshit was what that was. If going through things once was enough, he would have been a fucking vacuum cleaner salesman like his father. Go through with it then. Go all the way through it, Paul. Start with misery. No. Yes. Fuck you. Paul leaned back, put a hand over his eyes, and, like it or not, he began to go through it. All the way through it. I have a good day. Gonna lurk while I get ready. Oh yeah, you're working on the weekend, huh? I'm glad I don't have to work on weekends anymore. At least, unless I want to. Most of the time I don't, though. But yeah, I'm gonna have another sip. Yeah, I have that. Ooh, that was spicy. Holy shit. Yeah, I have that lemon and ginger stuff I add to my green tea. And I just got like a big chunk of like dehydrated ginger. I mean, I guess in this case it was rehydrated by the tea. and it was very spicy. I guess the proper term is like zesty or whatever, but it gave me a bit of a shock. Oh gosh. Did y'all hear that? Fucking motorcycle people out here going crazy just cause the weather's good. Anyways. Ooh. I mean, I feel like I got rid of most of that like thing in my throat, but it's still like there a little bit. No, it's not tummy rumbling. It's the people outside, as it is most of the time. Ugh, just had to get that hiccup out of the way. Okay. He hadn't died, hadn't slept, but for a while after Annie hobbled him, the pain went away. He had only drifted, feeling untethered from his body, a balloon of pure thought rising away from its string. Oh shit, why was he bothering? She had done it, and all the time between then and now had been pain and boredom, and occasional bouts of work on his stupidly melodramatic book to escape the former two. The whole thing was meaningless. Oh, but it's not. There's a theme here, Paul. It's the thread that runs through everything. The thread that runs so true. Can't you see it? Misery, of course. That was the thread that ran through everything, but true thread or false, it was so goddamn silly. As a common noun, it meant pain, usually lengthy and often pointless. As a proper one, it meant a character and a plot, the latter most assuredly lengthy and pointless, but on which would nonetheless end very soon. Misery ran through the last 4, or maybe it was 5, months of his life. All right, plenty of misery. Misery day in and misery day out. But surely that was too simple, surely. Oh no, Paul, nothing is simple about misery. Except that you owe her your life, such as that may be. Because you turned out to be shad after all, didn't you? It's that fucking like Arabic word again. I never learned how to pronounce it right. Again, he tried to turn aside from these thoughts, but found himself unable. The persistence of memory and all that. Hacks just want to have fun. Then an unexpected idea came. A new one which opened a whole new avenue of thought. What you keep overlooking, because it's so obvious, is that you were, all, or are, also Sherazad. I'm assuming that's how you say it, to yourself. He blinked, lowering his head and staring stupidly out into the summer he had never expected he would see. Annie's shadow passed and then disappeared again. Was that true? Sherazad, to myself, he thought again. If so, then he was faced with an idiocy that was utterly colossal. He owed his survival to the fact that he wanted to finish the piece of shit Annie had coerced him into writing. He should have died, but couldn't. Not until he knew how it all came out. Oh, you're fucking crazy. You sure? No, he was no longer sure. Not about anything. With one exception, his whole life had hinged and continued to hinge on misery. He let his mind drift. The cloud, he thought. Begin with the cloud. Ooh my. These chapters are getting shorter, but we're still like... We're only about like 20 pages through. I guess I like went a little too like short. Or like I went like a little too like slow with the reading of the like amputation scene. Alright, moving on. This time the cloud had been darker, denser, somehow smoother. There was a sensation not of floating, but of sliding. Sometimes thoughts came, and sometimes there was pain, and sometimes, dimly, he heard Annie's voice, sounding the way it had been when the burning manuscript and the barbecue threatened to get out of control. Drink this, Paul. You've got to. Sliding? No, that was not quite the right verb. The right verb was sinking. He remembered a telephone call which had come at 3 in the morning. This was when he was in college. Sleepy fourth-floor dorm proctor, hammering on his door, telling him to come on and answer the fucking phone. His mother. Come home as quick as you can, Polly. Your father's had a bad stroke. He's sinking. And he had come as fast as he could, pushing his old Ford wagon to 70 in spite of the front-end shimmy that developed its speeds over 50. But in the end, it had all been for nothing. When he got there, his father was no longer sinking, but sunk. How close had he come to sinking on the night of the axe? He didn't know, but the fact that he had felt almost no pain during the week following the amputation was a pretty clear indicator of just how close, perhaps. That and the panic in her voice. He had lain in a semi-coma, barely breathing because of the respiratory depressant side effects of the medication. The glucose drips back in his arms again. And what brought him out of it was the beat of drums and the drone of bees. Borka drums, Borka bees, Borka dreams. Color bleeding slowly and relentlessly into a land and a tribe that never were beyond the margins of the paper on which he wrote. A dream of the goddess, the face of the goddess, looming black over the jungle green, brooding and eroded. Dark goddess, dark continent, a stone head full of bees. Overlying even all this was a picture which grew clearer and clearer, as if a giant slide had been projected against the cloud in which he lay, as time passed. It was a picture of a clearing in which one old eucalyptus tree stood. Hanging from the lowest branch of this tree was an old-fashioned pair of blue steel handcuffs. These were crawling over them. The cuffs were empty. They were empty because Misery had escaped. She had, hadn't she? Wasn't that how the story was supposed to go? It had been, but now he wasn't so sure. What was that? What was sorry. Was that what the empty handcuffs meant? Or had she been taken away? Taken into the idol? Taken to the queen bee, the big babe of the Borkas? You were also a Sherazade to yourself. Who are you telling this story for, Paul? Who are you telling it to? To Annie? Of course not. He did not look through that hole in the paper to see Annie, or please Annie. He looked through it to get away from Annie. The pain had started, and the itch. The cloud began to lighten again and rift apart. He began to glimpse the room, which was bad, and Annie, which was even worse. Still, he had decided to live. Some part of him that was as addicted to the chapter plays as Annie had been as a child had decided he could not die until he saw how it all came out. Had she escaped with the help of Ian and Joffrey? Or had she been taken into the head of the goddess? It was ridiculous, but these stupid questions all actually seemed to need answering. Okay. I didn't really expect the chapter to end there, but here we are. Alright. I got another piece of ginger in my mouth. Let me swallow that first. Okay. She didn't want to let him go back to work. Not at first. He could see it in her skittery eyes how frightened she had been and still was. How close he had come. She was taking extravagant care of him, changing the bandages on his weeping stump every 8 hours. And at first she had informed him with the air of one who knows she will never get a medal for what she has done. Although she deserves one. She had done it every 4 hours. Okay, yeah, you need to, like, not be here right now, Cat, please? Or at least, like, shush, if at all possible. Alright, so where were we? giving him sponge baths and alcohol rubs, as if to deny what she had done. Work, she said, would hurt him. It would put you back, Paul. I wouldn't say it if it weren't so, believe me. At least you know what's ahead. I'm dying to find out what happens next. It turned out she had read everything he had written, all his pre-surgery work, you might say, while he lingered near death. Better than 300 manuscript pages. He hadn't filled in the ends in the last 40 or so. Annie had done that. She showed him these with an uneasy, defiant sort of pride. Her ends were textbook neat, a striking comparison with his own, which had degenerated into a humpbacked scroll. Although Annie never said so, he believed she had filled in the ends either as another evidence of her solicitude. How can you say it was cruel to you, Paul, when you see all the ends I have filled in? Or as an act of atonement, or possibly even as a quasi-superstitious rite. Enough bandage changes, enough sponge baths, enough ends filled in, and Paul would live. Borka bee woman, work powerful mojo magic, Buana. Fill in all these who daddy ends and all be well again. That's how she had begun. But then the goddess sent in, or I guess that's, is that like, I don't know what that word's supposed to mean, but I don't think that's like what that is. Paul knew all the symptoms. When she said she was dying to find out what happened next, she wasn't kidding. Because you went on living to find out what happened next. Isn't that what you're really saying? Crazy as it was, shameful even in its absurdity, he thought it was. The gotta. Oh, this is like a metaphor. I thought he was talking about some kind of like infection. Whoops. It was something he had been irritated to find he could generate in the misery books, almost at will, but in his mainstream fiction erratically or not at all. You didn't know exactly where to find the gotta, but you always knew when you did. It made the needle of some internal Geiger counter swing all the way over to the end of the dial, even sitting in front of the typewriter slightly hungover, drinking cups of black coffee, and crunching a rollator tube every couple of hours, knowing he should give up the fucking cigarettes at least in the morning, but unable to bring himself to the sticking point. Months from finishing and light years from publication, you knew the gotta when you got it. Having it always made him feel slightly ashamed, manipulative, but it also made him feel vindicated in his labor. Christ, days went by and the hole in the paper was small, the light was dim, and the overheard conversations witless. You pushed on because that was all you could do. Confucius says if man... Confucius say if man want to grow 1 row of corn, first must shovel 1 ton of shit. And then one day the hole widened to Vista Vision width, and the light shone through like a sunray in a Cecil B. DeMille epic, and you knew you had the gotta, alive and kicking. The gotta, as in, I think I'll stay up another 15-20 minutes, honey. I gotta see how this chapter comes out. Even though the guy who says it spent the day at work thinking about getting laid, and knows the odds are good his wife is gonna be asleep when he finally gets up to the bedroom. The gotta, as in, I know I should be starting supper now. He'll be mad if it's TV dinners again. But I gotta see how this ends. I gotta know she will live. I gotta know, will he catch the shitheel who killed his father? I gotta know if she finds out her best friend's screwing her husband. The gotta... Nasty as a lewd act in a sleazy bar. Oh, you can't have the word. Oh shit! I have to readjust that. Thank you for reminding me. Yeah, thank you. What's that saying? Cab. Thank you, Cab. Yeah, that was one of the things I forgot to move, but now it's good now. There we go. Yeah. Okay. Nasty as a lewd and lascivious act in a sleazy bar. Fine as a... fine as a fuck from the world's most talented call girl. Oh boy, it was bad. And oh boy, it was good. And oh boy, in the end, it didn't matter how rude it was or how crude it was. Because in the end, it was just like the Jackson said on the record. On that record. Don't stop till you get enough. Okay. That was a painful one to read, man. Man, I'm already almost out of tea. Oh, how are we gonna get through this one? Alright. Stretch break? Yeah, I guess I have the... Ooh, man. I just looked out the window and they were like, it's sunsetting, the sun setting, and like the clouds are like this really nice shade of pink that I didn't notice before. Snack break. Oh man, I can't have too much snack because like my throat's already killing me, but I'll have like one little snack cracker. But yeah, I was I looked outside and it was nice out. That's my whole story. There's nothing more to that one. Ugh. I really need to find better snacks at some point. Okay. Let me just take a sip of tea to wash that down. Even though I'm running out of tea at like an alarming rate. Yeah, I'm running out of apples too. I only have like a couple left and I want to save them for like a special occasion, you know? Alright, back to the book. Back to what we all came here for tonight. You were also Sherazad to yourself. That was not an idea he was able to articulate or even understand. Not then. He had been in too much pain. But he had known just the same, hadn't he? Not you, the guys in the sweatshop. They knew. Yes, that had the ring of the right. The sound of the riding lawnmower swelled louder. Annie came into view for a moment. She looked at him, saw him looking back, and raised a hand to him. He raised one of his own, the one with the thumb still on it, in return. She passed from sight again. Good deal. He was finally able to convince her that returning to work would put him forward, not back. He was haunted by the specificity of those images which had lured him out of the cloud. And haunted was exactly the right word. Until they were written down, they were shades which would remain unlaid. And while she hadn't believed him, not then, she had allowed him to go back to work just the same. Not because he had convinced her, but because of the gotta. At first he had been able to work only in painfully short bursts. 15 minutes, maybe half an hour, if the story really demanded it of him. Even short bursts were agony. A shift in position caused the stem to become brightly alive, the way a smoldering brand will burst into flame while fanned by a breeze. It hurt furiously while he wrote, but that was not the worst. The worst was the hour or two afterward, when the healing stump would madden him like a drony itch, like swarming, sleepy bees. He had been right, not her. He never became really well. Probably could not do in such a situation. Because his health did improve and some of his strength came back. He was aware that the horizons of his interests had shrunk, but he accepted this as the price of survival. It was a genuine wonder he had survived at all. Sitting here in front of this typewriter, which, with its increasingly bad teeth, looking back over a period which had consisted of work rather than events. Paul nodded. Yes, he supposed he had been his own Sherazade, just as he was his own dream woman when he grabbed hold of and he did the things to the feverish beat of his fantasy. He didn't need a psychiatrist to point out that the writing had its autoerotic side. You beat a typewriter instead of doing the other thing. But why am I reading this? But both acts depended largely on quick wits, fast hands, and a heartfelt commitment to the act of the far-fetched. But hadn't there also been some sort of fuck, even if of the driest variety? Because once he started again, well, she wouldn't interrupt him while he was working, but she would take each day's output as soon as he was done, ostensibly to fill in the missing letters. But actually, he knew this by now, just as sexually acute men know which dates will put out at the end of the evening and which ones will not. To get her fix, to get her gotta. The chapter plays. Yes, back to that. Only for the last few months she's been going every day instead of just on Saturday afternoons. And the Paul who takes her is her pet writer instead of her older brother. His stints at the typewriter grew gradually longer as the pain slowly receded and some of his endurance returned. But ultimately, he wasn't able to write fast enough to satisfy her demands. The Gata which kept them both alive, and it had, but without it she surely would have murdered both him and herself long since, was also what had caused the loss of his thumb. It was horrible, but also sort of funny. Have a little irony, Paul. It's good for your blood. Okay. And one more meow out of you and I'm gonna have to put you out of the room. And think of how much worse it could have been. It could have been his, intimate zone, for instance. And I only have one of those, he said, and began to laugh wildly in the empty room in front of the hateful royal, with its gap-toothed grin. He laughed until his gut and stump both ached. Laughed until his mind ached. At some point, the laughter turned into horrible dry sobs that awoke pain, even in what remained of his left thumb. And when that happened, he was finally able to stop. He wondered in a dull sort of way how close he was to going insane. Not that it really mattered, he supposed. Okay, I'm gonna have to, go for a second to, put the cat out, because she's, being a piece of work, so I will be right back. Okay, she's out of the room. Ugh, good riddance. Alright, let me just put that back up. There we go. Yeah, this section of the book has been very interesting so far. I am gonna take another sip. The spiciness of the ginger just reminds me I'm alive, you know? Okay. Alright. I don't know why I'm having, throat problems today. But I'm gonna soldier on through it. One day, not long before the thumbectomy, perhaps even less than a week, Annie had come in with 2 giant dishes of vanilla ice cream, a can of Hershey's chocolate syrup, a pressure can of Reddi-wip, and a jar in which maraschino cherries red as heart's blood floated like biology specimens. I thought I'd make us sundaes, Paul, Annie said. Her tone was spuriously jolly. Paul didn't like it. not her tone of voice, nor the uneasy look in her eyes. "I'm being a naughty girl," that look said. It made him wary, put his wind up. It was too easy for him to imagine her looking exactly the same way when she put a heap of clothes on one set of stairs, a dead cat on another. "Why, thank you, Annie," he said, and watched as she poured the syrup and puffed two cumulus clouds of whipped cream out of the pressure can. She performed these chores with the practiced heavy hand of the long-time sugar junkie. "No need for thanks. You deserve it. You've been working so hard." She gave him his sundae. The sweetness became cloying after the third bite, but he kept on. It was wiser. One of the key rules to survival here on the scenic western slope was, to wit, when Annie's treatin', you best be eatin'. There was silence for a while, and then Annie put her spoon down, wiped a mixture of chocolate syrup and melting ice cream off her chin with the back of her hand, and said pleasantly, "Tell me the rest." Paul put his spoon down. "I beg your pardon?" "Tell me the rest of the story. I can't wait. I just can't." And hadn't he known this was coming? Yes. If someone had delivered all 20 reels of the new Rocket Man chapter plays to Annie's house, would she have waited, parceling out only one a week, or even one a day? He looked at the half-demolished avalanche of her sundae, one cherry almost buried in whipped cream, another floating in chocolate syrup. He remembered the way the living room had looked, with sugar-glazed dishes everywhere. No, Annie was not the waiting type. Annie would have watched all 20 episodes in one night, even if they gave her eye strain and a splitting headache, because Annie loved sweet things. "I can't do that," he said. Her face had darkened at once, but hadn't there been a shadowy relief there as well? "Oh? Why not?" "Because you wouldn't respect me in the morning," he thought of saying, and clamped down on that. Clamped down hard. "Because I'm a rotten storyteller," he answered instead. She slurped up the remainder of her sundae in 5 huge spoonfuls that would have left Paul's throat gray with frostbite. Then she set her dish down and looked at him angrily, not as if he were the great Paul Sheldon, but as if he were someone who had presumed to criticize the great Paul Sheldon. "If you're such a rotten storyteller, how come you have bestsellers and millions of people who love the books you write?" "I didn't say I was a rotten story writer. I actually happen to think I'm pretty good at that. But as a storyteller, I'm the pits." "You're just making up a big cock-a-doodle excuse." Her face was darkening. Her hands were clenched into shiny fists on the heavy material of her skirt. Hurricane Annie was back in the room. Everything that went around came around. Except things no longer had been quite the same, had they? He was as scared of her as ever, but her hold over him had nonetheless diminished. His life no longer seemed like such a big deal, gotta or no gotta. He was only afraid she would hurt him. "It's not an excuse," he replied. "The two things are like apples and oranges, Annie. People who tell stories usually can't write stories. If you really think people who can write stories can talk worth a damn, you never watched some poor slob of a novelist fumbling his way through an interview on the Today Show." "Well, I don't want to wait," she sulked. "I made you that nice sundae, and the least you could do is tell me a few things. It doesn't have to be exactly the whole story, I guess, but did the Baron kill Calthorpe?" Her eyes sparkled. "That's one thing I really want to know. And what did he do with the body if he did? Is it all cut up in that trunk his wife wouldn't let out of her sight? That's what I think." Paul shook his head, not to indicate she had it wrong, but to indicate he would not tell. She became even blacker, yet her voice was soft. "You're making me very angry. You know that, don't you, Paul?" "Of course I know it. but I can't help it. I could make you. I could make you help it. I could make you tell. But she looked frustrated, as if knowing that she could not. She could make him say some things, but she could not make him tell. Annie, do you remember telling me what a little kid says to his mother when she catches him playing with the cleaning fluid under the sink and makes him stop? Mommy, you're mean. Isn't that what you're saying now? Paul, you're mean. If you make me much madder, I don't promise to be responsible, she said. But he sensed the crisis was already past. She was strangely vulnerable to these concepts of discipline and behavior. Well, I'll have to chance that, he said. Because I'm just like that mother. I'm not saying no to be mean or to spite you. I'm saying no because I really want you to like the story. And if I give you what you want, you won't like it. And you won't want it anymore. And then what will happen to me, Annie? He thought, but did not say. Oh, wow. Whoa, hey, there's a slur in here. At least tell me if that upstanding gentleman, Hezekiah, really does know where Misery's father is. At least tell me that. that came out of left field. Holy shit. Do you want the novel? Or do you want me to fill out a questionnaire? Don't you take that sarcastic tone to me. Then don't you pretend you don't understand what I'm saying, he shouted back. She recoiled from him in surprise and unease, the last of that blackness going out of her face, and all that was left was that weird little girl look, the I've been naughty look. You want to cut open the golden goose. That's what it finally comes down to. But when the farmer in the story finally did it, all he had was a dead goose and a bunch of worthless guts. All right, she said. All right, Paul. Are you gonna finish your sundae? I can't eat anymore, he said. I see. I've upset you. I'm sorry. I expect that you're right. I was wrong to ask. She was perfectly calm again. He had half expected another period of deep depression or rage to follow, but none had. They had simply gone back to the old routine. Paul writing, Annie reading each day's output. And enough time had passed between the argument and the thumectomy that Paul had missed the connection. Until now. I bitched about the typewriter, he thought, looking at it now and listening to the drone of the mower. It sounded fainter now, and he was marginally aware that that wasn't because Annie was moving away, but because he was drowsing off. He did that a lot now, simply drowsed off like some old fart in a nursing home. Not a lot. I only bitched about it that once. But once was enough, wasn't it? More than enough. That was what? A week after she brought those Oogie Sundays? Just about that. Just a week and one bitch. About how the clunk of that dead key was driving me crazy. I didn't even suggest that she get another used typewriters from Nancy Whoremonger or whoever that woman was. One with all its keys intact. I just said those clunks are driving me crazy. And then, in almost no time at all, presto changeo. When it comes to Paul's left thumb, now you see it, and now you don't. Except she didn't really do it because I bitched about the typewriter, did she? She did it because I told her no, and she had to accept that. It was an act of rage. The rage was the result of realization. What realization? Why, that she didn't hold all the cards after all. I had a certain passive hold over her. The power of the Gada. I turned out to be a pretty passable Sherazade after all. It was crazy. It was funny. It was also real. Millions might scoff, but only because they fail to realize how pervasive the influence of art, even of such a degenerate sort as popular fiction, could become. Housewives arranged their schedule around the afternoon soaps. If they went back into the workplace, they made buying a VCR a top priority, so they could watch those same soap operas at night. When Arthur Conan Doyle killed Sherlock Holmes at Reichenbach Falls, all of Victorian England arose as one and demanded him back. The tone of their protest had been Annie's exactly. Not bereavement, but outrage. Doyle was berated by his own mother when he wrote and told her of his intention to do away with Holmes. Her indignant reply had come by return mail. "Kill that nice Mr. Holmes? Foolishness. Don't you dare." Or there was the case of his friend Gary Rudman, who worked for the Boulder Public Library. When Paul had dropped over to see him one day, he had found Gary's shades drawn and a black crepe fluff on the door. Concerned, Paul had knocked hard until Gary answered. "Go away," Gary told him. "I'm feeling depressed today. Someone died, someone important to me." When Paul asked who, Gary had responded tiredly. "Vandervalk." Paul had heard him walk away from the door, and although he knocked again, Gary did not come back. Vandervalk, it turned out, was a fictional detective created, and then uncreated, by a writer named Nicholas Freeling. Paul had been convinced Gary's reaction had been more than false. He thought it had been pretentiously arty. In short, a pose. He continued to feel this way until 1983, when he read The World According to Garp. He made the mistake of reading the scene where Garp's younger brother dies, impaled on a gearshift lever, shortly before bed. It was hours before he slept. That scene would not leave his mind. The thought that grieving for a fictional character was absurd did more than cross his mind during his tossings and turnings. For grieving was exactly what he was doing, of course. The realization had not helped, however, and this had caused him to wonder if perhaps Gary Rudman hadn't been a lot more serious about Vandervalk than Paul had given him credit for at the time. And this had caused another memory to resurface. Finishing William Golding's Lord of the Flies at the age of 12 on a hot summer day, going to the refrigerator for a cold glass of lemonade, and then suddenly changing direction and speeding up from an amble to an all-out bolt which had ended in the bathroom. There he had leaned over the toilet and vomited. Paul suddenly remembered other examples of this odd mania. The way people had mobbed the Baltimore docks each month when the packet bearing the new installment of Mr. Dickens' Little Dorrit or Oliver Twist was due. Some had drowned, but this did not discourage the others. The old woman of 105 who had declared she would fast until Mr. Galsworthy finished the Forsyte saga, and who had died less than an hour after having the final page of the final volume read to her. The young mountain climber hospitalized with a supposedly fatal case of hypothermia, whose friends had read The Lord of the Rings to him, non-stop around the clock, until he came out of his coma. Hundreds of other such incidents. Every best-selling writer of fiction would, he supposed, have his own... He supposed. I could have just went through that. Suppose have his own personal example or examples of radical reader involvement with the make-believe worlds the writer creates. Examples of the Scheherazade complex, Paul thought now, half dreaming as the sound of Annie's mower ebbed and flowed at some great echoing distance. He remembered getting 2 letters suggesting Misery's theme parks on the order of Disney World or Great Adventure. One of these letters had included a crude blueprint, but the blue ribbon winner, at least until Annie Wilkes had entered his life, had been Mrs. Roman D. Sandpaper III of Ink Beach, Florida. Mrs. Roman D. Sandpiper, not Sandpaper. Mrs. Roman D. Sandpiper, whose given name was Virginia, had turned an upstairs room of her home into Misery's parlor. She included Polaroids of Misery's spinning wheel, Misery's escritoire, complete with a half-completed bread and butter note to Mr. Favery, saying she would be in attendance at the school hall recitation on 20th November. Done in what Paul thought was an eerily apt hand for his heroine. Not a round and flowing lady's script, but a half-feminine copper plate. Misery's couch, Misery's sampler. Let love instruct you. Do not presume to instruct love, etc., etc. The furnishings, Mrs. Roman D. Virginia Sandpiper's letter said, were all genuine, not reproductions. And while Paul could not tell for sure, he guessed that it was the truth. If so, this expensive bit of make-believe must have cost Mrs. Roman D. Virginia Sandpiper thousands of dollars. Mrs. Roman D. Virginia Sandpiper hastened to assure him that she was not using his character to make money, nor did she have any plans in that direction, heaven forbid. But she did want him to see the pictures, and to tell her what she had wrong, which she was sure must be a great deal. Mrs. Roman D. Virginia Sandpiper also hoped for his opinion. Looking at those pictures had given him a feeling which was strange yet eerily intangible. It had been like looking at photographs of his own imagination. And he knew from that moment on, whenever he tried to imagine Misery's little combination parlor and study, Mrs. Roman D. Virginia Sandpiper's Polaroids would leap immediately into his mind, obscuring imagination with their cheery but one-dimensional concreteness. Tell her what was wrong? That was madness. From now on, he would be the one to wonder about that. He had written back a brief note of congratulations and admiration, a note which hinted not at all at certain questions concerning Mrs. Roman D. Virginia Sandpiper, which had crossed his mind. How tightly wrapped was she, for instance? And had received another letter in return with a fresh slew of Polaroids. Mrs. Roman D. Virginia Sandpiper's first communication had consisted of a 2-page handwritten letter and 7 Polaroids. The second consisted of a 10-page handwritten letter and 40 Polaroids. The letter was an exhaustive and ultimately exhausting manual of where Mrs. Roman D. Virginia Sandpiper had found each piece and how much she had paid, and the restoration processes involved. Mrs. Roman D. Virginia Sandpiper told him that she had found a man named McKibben who owned an old squirrel rifle and had gotten him to put the bullet hole in the wall by the chair. While she could not swear to the historical accuracy of the gun, Mrs. Roman D. Virginia Sandpiper admitted she knew the caliber was right. The pictures were mostly close detail shots, but for the handwritten captions on the backs, they could have been the best photos in one of the What's This Picture features in Puzzle magazine, where Maxif Photography makes the straight arm of a paperclip look like a pylon and the pop top of a beer can like a Picasso sculpture. Paul had not answered this letter, but that had not deterred Mrs. Roman D. Virginia Sandpiper, who had sent 5 more, the first 4 with additional Polaroids, before finally lapsing into puzzled, slightly hurt silence. The last letter had been simply, stiffly signed Mrs. Roman D. Sandpiper. The invitation, however parenthetically made, to call her Virginia had been withdrawn. This woman's feelings, obsessed though they might have been, had never evolved into Annie's paranoid fixation. But Paul understood now that the wellspring had been the same. The Sherazade complex, the deep and elemental drawing power of the Gada. His floating deepened. He slept. Oh man, that was a long one. Christ. Nothing like a good gulp of like lemon, ginger, honey, green tea to like wake up your old, your million years old vocal cords. Actually, I'm gonna take another. I don't exactly remember like how many more chapters there are until we get to our next goal. Alright. He dozed off these days as old men doze off, abruptly and sometimes at inappropriate times, and he slept as old men sleep, which is to say, only separated from the waking world by the thinnest of skins. He didn't stop hearing the riding mower, but its sound became deeper, rougher, choppier, the sound of the electric knife. He had picked the wrong day to start complaining about the Royal and its missing N. And of course, there was never a right day to say no to Annie Wilkes. Punishment might be deferred, but never escaped. Well, if it bothers you so much, I'll just have to give you something to take your mind off that old N. He heard her rummaging around in the kitchen, throwing things, cursing in her strange Annie Wilkes language. 10 minutes later, she came in with the syringe, the betadine, and the electric knife. All began to scream at once. He was, in a way, like Pavlov's dogs. When Pavlov rang a bell, the dogs salivated. When Annie came into the guest bedroom with a hypo, a bottle of betadine, and a sharp cutting object, Paul began to scream. She had plugged the knife into the outlet by his wheelchair. There had been more pleading and more screaming, and more promises that he would be good. When he tried to thrash away from the hypo, she told him to sit still and be good, or what was going to happen would happen without the benefit of even light anesthesia. When he continued to pull away from the needle, mewling and pleading, Annie suggested that if that really was the way he had felt, maybe she just ought to use the knife on his throat and be done with it. Then he had been still and let her give him the injection, and this time the betadine had gone over his left thumb, as well as the blade of the knife. When she turned it on and the blade began to saw rapidly back and forth in the air, the betadine flew in a spray of maroon droplets she seemed not to notice. And in the end, of course, there had been much rudder droplets spraying into the air as well. Because when Annie decided on a course of action, she carried it through. Annie was not swayed by pleas. Annie was not swayed by screams. Annie had the courage of her convictions. As the humming, vibrating blade sank into the soft web of flesh between the soon-to-be defunct thumb and his first finger, she assured him again in her "this hurts mother more than it hurts Polly" voice that she loved him. Then that night, "You're not dreaming, Paul. You're thinking about things you don't dare think about while you're awake. So wake up. For God's sake, wake up." He couldn't wake up. She had cut his thumb off in the morning, and that night she swept gaily into the room, where he sat in a stupid daze of drugs and pain, with his wrapped left hand against his chest, and she held a cake, and she was bellowing "Happy birthday to you" in her on-key but tuneless voice, although it was not his birthday, and there were candles all over the cake. And sitting in the exact center, pushed into the frosting like an extra big candle, had been his thumb, his gray dead thumb, the nails slightly ragged because he sometimes chewed it when he was stuck for a good word. And she told him, "If you promise to be good, Paul, you can have a piece of birthday cake, but you won't have to eat any of the special candle." So he promised to be good because he didn't want to be forced to eat any of the special cake, but also because mostly because Annie was great, Annie was good. Let us thank her for our food, including that we don't have to eat. Girls just want to have fun. But something wicked this way comes. Please don't make me eat my thumb, Annie the mom. Annie the goddess, when Annie's around, you better stay honest. And she knows when you've been sleeping, she knows when you're awake, she knows if you've been bad or good, so be good for goodness sake. You better not cry, you better not pout, but most of all, you better not scream. Don't scream, don't scream, don't scream, don't. He hadn't. And now, as he awoke, he did so with a jerk that hurt him all over. Hardly aware that his lips were pressed tightly together to keep the scream inside, although the thumectomy had happened over a month ago. He was so preoccupied with not screaming that for a moment he didn't even see what was coming into the driveway. And when he did see it, he believed at first that it must be a mirage. It was the Colorado State Police car. Oh, it's about to get wacky. It's about to get silly. Ooh, ooh, ooh. Oh, man. What you gonna do? What you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you? Following the amputation of his thumb, there had been a dim period where Paul's greatest single accomplishment, other than working on the novel, had been to keep track of the days. He had become pathological about it, sometimes spending as long as 5 minutes lost in a daze, counting back, making sure he hadn't somehow forgotten one. "I'm getting as bad as she is," he thought once. His mind had returned wearily. So what? He had done pretty well with the book following the loss of his foot, during what Annie so mincingly called his convalescent period. No, pretty well was false modesty if ever there was such a thing. He had done amazingly well for a man who had once found it impossible to write if he was out of cigarettes, or he had a backache, or a headache, or a degree or two above a low drone. It would be nice to believe he had performed heroically, but he supposed it was only that escape thing again, because the pain had been really dreadful. When the healing process finally did begin, he thought the phantom itch of the foot, which was no longer there, was even worse than the pain. It was the arch of the missing foot which bothered him the most. He awoke time after time in the middle of the night using the big toe of his right foot to scratch the thin air 4 inches below the place where, on that side, his body now ended. But he hadn't gone on working just the same. It wasn't until after the thymectomy, and that bizarre birthday cake like a leftover prop from whatever happened to baby Jane, that the balls of crumpled up paper had begun to proliferate in the wastebasket again. Lose a foot, almost die, go on working. Lose a thumb and run into some kind of weird trouble. Wasn't it supposed to be the other way around? Well, there was the fever. He had spent a week in bed with that, but it was pretty minor league stuff. The highest his temperature had ever gone was 100.7, and that wasn't exactly the stuff of which high melodrama was made. The fever had probably been caused more by his general run-down condition than any specific infection, and an oogie old fever was no problem for Annie. Among her other souvenirs, Annie had Keflex and ampicillin up the old kazoo. She dosed him and he got better. As better as it was possible to get under such bizarre circumstances at any rate. But something was wrong. He seemed to have lost some vital ingredient, and the mix had become a lot less potent as a result. He tried to blame it on the missing N, but he'd had to contend with that before, and really, what was a missing N compared to a missing foot, and now, as an extra added attraction, a missing thumb? Whatever the reason, something had disturbed the dream. Something was whittling away the circumference of that hole in the paper through which he saw. Once, he would have sworn it was so. That hole had been as big as the bore of the Lincoln Tunnel. Now it was no more than the size of a knothole, which a sidewalk superintendent might stoop to snoop through on an interesting piece of building instruction. You had to peer and crane to see anything at all. And more often than not, the really important things happened outside your field of vision. Not surprising, considering the field of vision was so small. In practical terms, what had happened following the thymectomy and ensuing bout of fever was obvious. The language of the book had grown florid and overblown again. It was not self-parody yet, not quite, but it was floating steadily in that direction, and he seemed helpless to stop it. Continuity lapses had begun to proliferate with the stealth of rats breeding in cellar corners. For a space of 30 pages, the Baron had become the Viscount from Misery's Quest. He'd had to go back and tear that all out. It doesn't matter, Paul, he told himself again and again in those last few days, before the royal coughed up first its T and then its E. The damn thing is almost done. So it was. Working on it was torture, and finishing it was going to mean the end of his life. That the latter had begun to look slightly more attractive than the former said all that probably needed to be said about the worsening state of his body, mind, and spirit. And the book moved on in spite of everything, seemingly independent of them. The continuity drops were annoying but minor. He was having more problems with the actual make-believe than he had ever had before. The game of Can You had become a labored exercise rather than simple good fun. Yet the book had continued to roll in spite of all the terrible things Annie had subjected him to. And he could bitch about how something, his guts maybe, had run out of him along with the half pint or so of thumb he'd lost when she took his thumb. But it was still a goddamn good yarn. The best Misery novel by far. The plot was melodramatic but well constructed in its own modest way. Quite amusing. If it were ever to be published in something other than the severely limited, first printing, one copy Annie Wilkes edition, he guessed it might sell like a mad bastard. Yeah, he supposed he would get through it, if the goddamn typewriter held together. You were supposed to be so tough, he had thought once, after one of his compulsive lifting exercises. His thin arms were trembling, the stump of his thumb aching feverishly, his forehead covered with a thin oil of sweat. You were the tough young gunsel looking to make a rep off the tired old turd of a sheriff, right? Only you've already thrown one key, and I see you the same way as some of the others. The T, the E, and the G, for instance, are starting to look funny. Sometimes leaning one way, sometimes leaning the other. Sometimes riding a little high on the line, sometimes dipping a little low. I think maybe the tired old turd is going to win this one, my friend. I think maybe the tired old turd is going to beat you to death. And it could be that the bitch knew it. Could be that's why she took my left thumb. Like the saying goes, she may be crazy, but she sure ain't dumb. He looked at the typewriter with tired intensity. Go on and break. I'll finish anyway. If she wants to get me a replacement, I'll thank her kindly. But if she doesn't, I'll finish on the goddamn legal pads. The one thing I won't do is scream. I won't scream. I won't. There's starting to be a lot of ginger, like little ginger pieces in my teacup. And it's starting to be a little bit hard to like avoid, you know? Let me take another. My throat's starting to give out. We're almost like, we only, it's like 31 more pages, I think, until we reach our goal for the night. So I'm treating myself to extra sips. I won't scream. He sat at the window, totally awake now. Totally aware that the police car he was seeing in Annie's driveway was as real as his left foot had once been. Scream, goddammit, scream! He wanted to, but the dictum was too strong. Just too strong. He couldn't even open his mouth. He tried and saw the brownish droplets of betadine flying from the blade of the electric knife. He tried and heard the squeal of axe against bone, the soft flump as the match in her hand lit the burn-o-matic. He tried to open his mouth and couldn't. Tried to raise his hands, couldn't. A horrible moaning sound passed between his closed lips and his hands made light, haphazard drumming sounds on either side of the royal. But that was all he could do. All the control of his destiny he could seem to take. Nothing which had gone before. except perhaps for the movement when he had realized that, although his left leg was moving, his left foot was staying put, was as terrible as the hell of this immobility. In real time, it did not last long. Perhaps 5 seconds, and surely no longer than 10. But inside Paul Sheldon's head, it seemed to go on for years. There, within plain sight, was salvation. All he had to do was break the window and the dog lock the bitch had put on his tongue and scream, "Help me, help me, save me from Annie, save me from the goddess." At the same time, another voice was screaming, "I'll be good, Annie. I won't scream. I'll be good. I'll be good for goddess's sake. I promise not to scream, just don't chop off any more of me." Had he known before this, had he really known how badly she had cowed him, or how much of his essential self, the liver and lights of his spirit, she had scraped away? He knew how constantly he had been terrorized, but did he know how much of his own subjective reality, once so strong he had taken it for granted, had been erased? He knew one thing with some certainty. A lot more was wrong with him than paralysis of the tongue. Just as a lot more was wrong with him. Just as a lot more was wrong with what he had been writing than the missing key or the fever or continuity lapses or even a loss of guts. The truth of everything was so simple in its horridness. So dreadedly simple. He was dying by inches. But dying that way wasn't as bad as he had already feared. But he was also fading. And that was an awful thing because it was moronic. "Don't scream," the panicky voice screamed just as the cop opened the door of his cruiser and stepped out, adjusting his smoky bear hat as he did so. He was young, no more than 22 or 3, wearing sunglasses as black as the liquid-looking, just as black and liquid-looking as dollops of crude oil. He paused to adjust the creases of his khaki uniform pants, and 30 yards away, a man with blue eyes bulging from his white and whiskery old man's face sat staring at him from behind a window, moaning through closed lips, hands rattling uselessly on a board laid across the arms of a wheelchair. "Don't scream. Yes, scream. Scream and it will be over. Scream and it can end. Never, never going to end. Not until I'm dead. That kid's no match for the goddess. Paul, oh Christ, are you dead? Seriously? Scream, you chicken shit motherfucker. Scream your fucking head off." His lips pulled apart with the minute tearing sound. He hitched air into his lungs and closed his eyes. He had no idea what was going to come out, or if anything really was, until it came. "Africa!" Paul screamed. Now his trembling hands flew up like startled birds and clapped against the sides of his head, as if to hold in his exploding brains. "Africa! Help me! Help me! Africa!" Okay. Wait, Kaiser, what are you doing? What? Why are you here? Thank you for the raid. Hi everybody. We are reading Misery. I mean, you're probably not gonna understand what's going on, but we're at like the good part, as they say. So yeah, I'm gonna take a sip of my tea real quick, and then I'm gonna keep going, and I hope you appreciate it. Ooh. Okay, let's go, baby. His eyes snapped open. The cop was looking towards the house. Paul could not see the Smoky's eyes because of the sunglasses, but the tilt of his head expressed moderate puzzlement. He took a step closer, then stopped. Paul looked down at the board. To the left of the typewriter was a heavy ceramic ashtray. Once upon a time it would have been filled with crushed butts. Now it held nothing more haphazard to his health than paper clips and a typewriter eraser. He seized it and threw it at the window. Glass shattered outward. To Paul, it was the most liberating sound he had ever heard. Oh shit. quick recap. This guy's like trapped in a crazy woman's house, and like this cop just pulled up, and he's trying to break free and catch his attention. That's basically it. Okay. Glass shattered outward. To Paul, it was the most liberating sound he had ever heard. The walls came tumbling down, he thought giddily, and screamed, "Over here! Help me! Watch out for this woman! She's crazy!" The state cop stared at him. His mouth dropped open. He reached into his breast pocket and brought out something that could only be a picture. He consulted it and then advanced to the edge of the driveway. There he spoke the only 4 words Paul ever heard him say. The last 4 words anyone ever heard him say. Following them, he would make a number of inarticulate sounds, but no real words. "Oh shit," the cop exclaimed. "It's you." Paul's attention had been so fiercely focused on the trooper that he did not see Annie until it was too late. When he did see her, he was struck by a real superstitious horror. Annie had become a goddess, a thing that was half woman and half lawn boy, a weird female centaur. Her baseball cap had fallen off. Her face was twisted into a frozen snarl. In one hand she held a wooden cross. It had marked the grave of the Bossy. Or Bessie? Huh? Paul didn't remember if it was number 1 or number 2, which had finally stopped bawling. That Bessie had indeed died, and when spring had softened the ground enough, Paul had watched from his window, sometimes dumbstruck with awe, and sometimes overcome with shrieking attacks of the giggles. As she first dug the grave, it had taken her most of the day, and then dragged Bessie, who had also softened considerably, out from behind the barn. She had used a chain attached to the Cherokee's trailer hitch to do this. She had looped the other end of the chain around Bessie's middle. Paul made a mental bet with himself that Bessie would tear in half before Annie got her into the grave. But that one he lost. Annie tumbled Bessie in, then stolidly began refilling the hole, a job she hadn't finished until long after dark. Paul had watched her plant the cross and then read the Bible over the grave by the light of a new risen spring moon. Now she was holding the cross like a spear. The dirt-darkened point of its vertical post pointed squarely at the trooper's back. "Behind you! Look out!" Paul shrieked, knowing he was too late, but shouting anyway. With a thin, warbling cry, Annie plunged Bessie's cross into the trooper's back. The cop said. I mean, it says AG. I thought it was just like AG, but it's the cop said, and walked slowly onto the lawn, his pierced back arched and his gut sticking out. His face was the face of a man either trying to pass a kidney stone or having a terrible gas attack. The cop began to droop toward the ground as the trooper approached the window in which Paul sat. His gray invalid's face framed by jags of broken glass. The cop reached slowly over his shoulders with both hands. He looked at Paul like a man trying very hard to scratch that one itch you can never quite scratch. Annie had dismounted the lawn boy and had been standing frozen, her tented fingers pressed against the peaks of her breasts. Now she lunged forward and snatched the cross out of the trooper's back. He turned toward her, groping for his service pistol, and Annie drove the cross point first into his belly. "Ugh," the cop said this time, and dropped to his knees, clutching his stomach. As he bent over, Paul could see the slit in his brown uniform shirt, where the first blow had gone home. Annie pulled the cross free again. Its sharpened point had broken off, leaving a jagged, splintery stump, and drove it into his back between the shoulder blades. She looked like a woman trying to kill a vampire. The first 2 blows had perhaps not gone deep enough to do much damage, but this time the cross's support post went at least 3 inches into the kneeling trooper's back, driving him flat. There, Annie cried, wrenching Bessie's memorial marker out of his back. How do you like that, you dirty old bird? Annie, stop it, Paul shouted. She looked up at him, her dark eyes momentarily as shiny as coins, her hair fungus frowsy around her face, the corners of her mouth drawn up in the jolly grin of a lunatic who has, at least for the moment, cast aside all restraints. Then she looked back down at the state trooper. There, she cried, and drove the cross into his back again, and his buttocks, and the upper thigh of one leg, and his neck, and his crotch. She stabbed him with it half a dozen times, screaming there every time she brought it down again. Then the cross's upright split. There, she said, almost conversationally, and walked away in the direction from which she had come running. Just before she passed from Paul's view, she tossed the bloody cross aside as if it no longer interested her. Ugh. Let me take my tea again. Ugh. I was going to speak, but I still had a little bit of tea in the back of my throat. It made me almost choke. Yeah, we have like, what is it, 25 more pages? So let's get it. Oh god, I hope that doesn't mess me up too much. Jeez. Alright. Paul put his hands on the wheels of the chair, not at all sure where he intended to go or what, if anything, he meant to do when he got there. To the kitchen for a knife, perhaps? Not to try and kill her, oh no. She would take one look at the knife in his hand and step back into the shed for her 30-30. Not to kill her, but to defend himself from her revenge by cutting his wrists open. He didn't know if that had been his intention or not, but it surely did seem like a hell of a good idea. Because if there had ever been a time to exit stage left, this was it. He was tired of losing pieces of himself to her fury. Then he saw something which froze him in place. The cop. The cop was still alive. He raised his head. His sunglasses had fallen off. Now Paul could see his eyes. Now he could see how young the cop was. How young and hurt and scared. Blood ran down his face in streams. He managed to get to his hands and knees, fell forward, then got painfully back up again. He began to crawl towards his cruiser. He worked his way halfway down the mild slope of grass between the house and the driveway, then overbalanced and fell on his back. For a moment he lay there with his legs drawn up, looking as helpless as a turtle on its shell. Then he slowly rolled over on his side and began the terrible job of getting to his knees again. His uniform shirt and pants were darkening with blood. Small patches were slowly spreading, meeting other patches growing bigger still. The Smoky reached the driveway. Suddenly the noise of the riding lawnmower was louder. "Look out," Paul screamed. "Look out! She's coming!" The cop turned his head. Groggy alarm surfaced on his face, and he grappled for his gun once more. He got out something big and black with a long barrel and brown wood grips. And then Annie reappeared, sitting tall in the saddle and driving the lawn boy as fast as it would go. "Shoot her!" Paul screamed. And instead of shooting Annie Wilkes with his big old dirty birdie hairy gun, he first fumbled, then dropped it. He stretched out his hand for it. Annie swerved and ran over his reaching hand and his forearm. Blood squirted from the lawn boy's grass exhaust in an amazing jet. The kid in the trooper uniform screamed. There was a sharp clang as the mower's whirling blade struck the pistol. Then Annie was swerving up the sideline, using it to turn, and her gaze fell on Paul for 1 second. And Paul felt sure he knew what the momentary gaze meant. First the Smoky, then him. The kid was lying on his side again. When he saw the mower bearing down on him, he rolled over on his back and dug frantically at the driveway dirt with his heels, trying to push himself under the cruiser where she couldn't get him. He didn't even come close. Annie throttled the riding lawnmower up to a scream and drove it over his head. Paul caught a last glimpse of horrified brown eyes, saw tatters of brown khaki uniform shirt hanging from an arm, raised in a feeble effort at protection, and when the eyes were gone, Paul turned away. The lawnboy's engine suddenly lugged down, and there was a series of fast, strangely liquid thudding sounds. Paul vomited beside the chair with his eyes closed. Oh man, it's getting like really intense. Now why is that happening? You see all that shit? I'm just trying to have my tea here. Anyways. I really hope my voice doesn't give out. He only opened them when he heard the rattle of her key in the kitchen door. His own door was open. He watched her approach down the hall in her old brown cowboy boots and her blue jeans with the keyring dangling from one of the belt loops, and her man's t-shirt now spotted with blood. He cringed away from her. He wanted to say, "If you cut anything else off me, Annie, I'm going to die. I won't take the shock of another amputation either. I'll die on purpose." But no words came out, only terrified chuffing noises that disgusted him. She gave him no time to speak anyway. "I'll deal with you later," she said, and pulled his door closed. One of her keys rattled in the lock. A new Krieg that would have defeated even Tom Twyford himself, Paul thought. And then she was striding down the hall again, the thud of her boot heels mercifully diminishing. He turned his head and looked dully out the window. He could only see part of the trooper's body. His head was still under the mower, which was in turn canted at a drunken angle against the cruiser. The riding mower was a small tractor-like vehicle for keeping larger than average lawns neat and clipped. It had not been designed to keep its balance as it passed over jutting rocks, fallen logs, or the head of state troopers. If the cruiser hadn't been parked exactly where it was, and if the trooper hadn't gotten exactly as close to it as he had before Annie struck him, the mower would have almost certainly tipped over, spilling her off. This might have caused her no harm at all, but it might have hurt her quite badly. She has the luck of the devil himself, Paul thought drearily, and watched as she put the mower in neutral and then pushed it off the trooper with one hard shove. The side of the mower squalled along the side of the cruiser and took off some paint. Now that he was dead, Paul could look at him. And the cop looked like a big, nasty doll that had been badly treated by a gang of nasty children. Paul felt a terrible, aching sympathy for this unnamed young man, but there was another emotion mixed with that. He determined it and was not much surprised to find that it was envy. The trooper would never go home to his wife and kids, if he had them, but on the other hand, he had escaped Annie Wilkes. She grabbed a bloody hand and dragged him up the driveway and through the barn doors, which stood ajar on their tracks. When she came out, she pushed them along the tracks as far as they would go, then walked back down to the cruiser. She was moving with a calm that was almost serenity. She started the cruiser and drove it into the barn. When she came out again, she closed the doors almost completely, leaving a gap just wide enough for her to slip in and out. She walked halfway down the driveway and looked around, hands on her hips. Again, Paul saw that remarkable expression of serenity. The bottom of the mower was smeared with blood, particularly around the grass exhaust, which was still dripping. Little scraps of khaki uniform lay in the driveway or fluttered in the freshly cut grass of the side lawn. There were daubs and splashes of blood everywhere. The trooper's gun, with a long slash of bright metal now scarring its barrel, lay in the dust. A square of stiff white paper had caught on the spines of a small cactus Annie had set out in May. Bessie's splintered cross lay in the driveway like a comment on the whole filthy mess. She moved out of his field of vision, heading towards the kitchen again. When she came in, he heard her singing. She'll be driving 6 white horses when she comes. She'll be driving 6 white horses when she comes. She'll be driving 6 white horses, driving 6 white horses. She'll be driving 6 white horses when she comes. When he saw her again, she had a big green garbage bag in her hands, and 3 or 4 more sticking out of the back pockets of her jeans. Big sweat stains darkened her t-shirt around her armpits and neck. When she turned, he saw a sweat stain that looked vaguely tree-like rising up her back. That's a lot of bags for a few scraps of cloth, Paul thought. But he knew that she would have plenty to put in them before she was done. She picked up the shreds of uniform and then the cross. She broke it into 2 pieces and dropped it into the plastic bag. Incredibly, she genuflected after doing this. She picked up the gun, rolled the cylinder, dumped the slugs, put them in one hip pocket, snapped the cylinder back in with a practiced flick of her wrist, and then stuck the gun in the waistband of her jeans. She plucked the piece of paper off the saguaro and looked at it thoughtfully. She stuck it into the other hip pocket. She went to the barn, tossed the garbage bags inside the doors, and came back to the house. She walked up the sideline to the cellar bulkhead, which was almost directly below Paul's window. But something else caught his eye, or her eye. It was his ashtray. She picked it up and handed it politely to him through the broken window. Here, Paul. Numbly, he took it. I'll get the paper clips later, she said, as if this was a question which must already have occurred to him. For one moment, he thought of bringing the heavy ceramic ashtray down on her head as she bent over, cleaving her skull with it, letting out the disease that passed for her brains. Then he thought of what would happen to him, what could happen to him, if he only hurt her, and put the ashtray where it had been with his shaking, thumbless hand. She looked at him. I didn't kill him, you know. Annie, you killed him. If you had kept your mouth shut, I would have sent him on his way. He'd be alive now, and there would be none of this oogie mess to clean up. Yes, Paul said. Down the road he would have gone. And what about me, Annie? She was pulling her hose out of the bulkhead and looping it over her arm. I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do. In the depth of his shock, he achieved his own serenity. He had my picture. It's in your pocket right now, isn't it? Ask me no questions, and I will tell you no lies. There was a faucet bib on the side of the house to the left of his window. She began to screw the end of the hose into it. The state cop with my picture means someone found my car. We both knew someone would. I'm only surprised it took so long. In a novel, a car might be able to float right out of the story. I guess I could make people believe it if I had to. But in real life, no way. But we went on fooling ourselves just the same, didn't we, Annie? You because of the book, me because of my life. Miserable as it has become to me. I don't know what you're talking about. She turned on the faucet. All I know is you killed that poor kid when you threw the ashtray through the window. You're getting what might happen to you, mixed up with what already happened to him. She grinned at him. There was a craziness in that grin, but he saw something else in it as well. Something that really frightened him. He saw the conscious evil in it. A demon capering behind her eyes. You bitch, he said. Crazy bitch, isn't that right? She asked, still smiling. Oh yeah, you're crazy, he said. Well, we'll have to talk about that, won't we? When I have more time. I'll have to talk about that a lot. But right now I'm very busy, as I think you can see. She unreeled the hose and turned it on. She spent nearly an hour hosing blood off the mower and driveway and the side lawn. while interlinked rainbows glimmered in the spray. Then she twisted the nozzle off and walked back along the hose's length, looping it over her arm. There was still plenty of light, but her shadow trailed long behind her. It was now 6 o'clock. She unscrewed the hose, opened the bulkhead, and dropped the green plastic snake inside. She closed the bulkhead, shot the bolt, and stood back, surveying the puddly driveway in the grass, which looked as though a heavy dew had fallen upon it. Annie walked back to the mower, got on, started it up, and drove it around back. Paul smiled a little. She had the luck of the devil, and when she was pressed, she had almost the cleverness of the devil. But almost was the key word. She had slipped in Boulder and wriggled away mostly due to luck. Now she had slipped again. He had seen it. She washed the blood off the mower, but forgotten the blade underneath. The whole blade housing, for that matter. She might remember later, but Paul didn't think so. Things had a way of dropping out of Annie's mind once the immediate moment was past. It occurred to him that the mind and the mower had a lot in common. What you could see looked all right, but if you turned the thing over to take a look at the works, you saw a blood-slimed killing machine with a very sharp blade. She returned to the kitchen door and let herself into the house again. She went upstairs and he heard her rummaging there for a while. Then she came down again more slowly, dragging something that sounded soft and heavy. After a moment's consideration, Paul rolled the wheelchair across to his door and leaned his ear against the wood. Dim, diminishing footfalls, slightly hollow, and still that soft flumping sound of something being dragged. Immediately his mind lit up with panicky floodlights and his skin flushed with his terror. Shed. She's gone to the shed to get the axe. It's the axe again. But this was only a momentary atavism, and he pushed it roughly away. She hadn't gone into the shed. She was going down to the cellar, dragging something down to the cellar. He heard her come up again and he rolled back to the window. As her boot heels approached his door, as the key slid into the lock again, he thought, she's come to kill me. And the only emotion this thought engendered was tired relief. Let me take another sip. Oh, I hope these next 20 pages go quick. My voice is starting to really give out. And I'm down to my last few sips. This is quite the bleak scenario. Okay. The door opened and Annie stood there, looking at him contemplatively. She had changed into a fresh white t-shirt and a pair of chinos. A small khaki bag, too big to be a purse and not quite big enough to be a knapsack, was slung over one shoulder. As she came in, he was surprised to find himself able to say it, and say it with a certain amount of dignity. Go ahead and kill me, Annie, if that's what you mean to do. But at least have the decency to make it quick. Don't cut anything more off of me. I'm not going to kill you, Paul. She paused. At least, not if I have just a little luck. I should kill you, I know that. But I'm crazy, right? And crazy people often don't look after their best interests, do they? She went behind him and propelled him across the room, out the door and down the hall. He could hear her bag slapping solidly against her side, and it occurred to him that he had never seen her carrying a bag like that before. If she went to town in a dress, she carried a big clunky purse. The sort of purse maiden aunts tote to church jumble sales. If she went in pants, she went with a wallet stuck in her hip pocket like a man. The sunlight slanting into the kitchen was strong, bright gold. Shadows from the legs of the kitchen table lay across the linoleum in horizontal stripes like the shadows of prison bars. It was 6:15 according to the clock over the range, and while there was no reason to believe she was any less sloppy about her clocks than her calendars, the one out here actually made it to May. That seemed about right. He could hear the first evening crickets tuning up in Annie's field. He thought, I heard that same sound as a small, unhurt boy, and for a moment he nearly wept. She pushed him into the pantry where the door to the basement stood open. Yellow light staggered up the stairs and fell dead onto the pantry floor. The smell of the late winter rainstorm which had flooded it still wintered. Spiders down there, he thought. Mice down there. Rats down there. Uh-huh, he told her. Count me out. She looked at him with a level short of impatience, and he realized that since killing the cop, she had seemed almost sane. Her face was the purposeful, if slightly harried face of a woman making ready for a big dinner party. You're going down there, she said. The only question is whether you're going down there piggyback or bum over tea kettle. I'll give you 5 seconds to decide. Piggyback, he said at once. Very wise. She turned around so he could put his arms around her neck. Don't do anything stupid like trying to choke me, Paul. I took a karate class in Harrisburg. I was good at it. I'll flip you. The floor is dirt, but very hard. You'll break your back. She hoisted him easily. His legs, now unsplinted but as crooked and ugly as something glimpsed through a rip in the canvas of a freak show tent, hung down. Then, the left with the salt dome where the knee had been was fully 4 inches shorter than the right. He had tried standing on the right leg and had found he could for short times, but doing so produced a low primal agony that lasted for hours. The dope couldn't touch that pain, which was like a deep physical sobbing. She carried him down and into a thickening smell of old stone and wood, and flood and rotting vegetables. There were 3 naked light bulbs. Old spiderwebs hung in rotting hammocks between bare beams. The walls were rock, carelessly chinked. They looked like a child's drawing of rock walls. It was cool, but not a pleasant cool. He had never been as close to her as he was then, as she carried him piggyback down the steep stairs. He would only be as close once again. It was not a pleasant experience. He could smell the sweat of her recent exertions, and while he actually liked the smell of fresh perspiration, he associated it with work, hard effort, things he respected. The smell was secretive and nasty, like old sheets thick with dried materials. And below the smell of sweat was a smell of very old dirt. Annie, he guessed, had gotten as casually catch as catch can about showering as she had about changing her calendars. He could see dark brown wax plugging one ear and wondered with faint disgust how the hell she could hear anything. Here, by one of the rock walls, was the source of that flumping, dragging sound. A mattress. Beside it, she had placed a collapsed TV tray. There were a few cans and bottles on it. She approached the mattress, turned around, and squatted. Get off, Paul. He released his hold cautiously and allowed himself to fall back on the mattress. He looked up at her warily as she stood and reached into the little khaki bag. No, he said immediately when he saw the 3rd yellow celluloid gleam on the hypodermic needle. No. Okay. I hope this is the final chapter. I'm really running out of tea. I'm down to my last sip or two. I'm rationing my sips. This is a bad spot to be in. Oh, that one burnt. And I have some ginger caught in my throat. Hold on. Okay. Right. Oh boy, she said. You must think Annie's in a real poopy-doopy mood today. I wish you'd relax, Paul. She put the hypo on the TV tray. That's scopolamine, which is a morphine-based drug. You're lucky I have any morphine at all. I told you how closely they watch it in the hospital pharmacies. Ugh, I get hiccups. I'm leaving it because it's damp down here and your legs may ache quite badly before I get back. Just a minute. She gave him a wink which had strangely unsettling undertones. A wink one conspirator might give another. You throw one cockadoodle ashtray and I'm as busy as a one-armed paper hanger. I'll be right back. She went upstairs and came back shortly with the cushions from the sofa in the parlor and the blankets from his bed. She arranged the cushions behind him so he could sit up without too much discomfort, but he could feel the sullen chill of the rocks even through the cushions, waiting to steal out and freeze him. There were 3 bottles of Pepsi on the collapsed TV tray. She opened 2 of them, using the opener on her keyring, and handed him one. She upended her own and drank half of it without stopping. Then she stifled a burp ladylike against her hand. We have to talk, she said. Or rather, I have to talk and you have to listen. Annie, when I said you were crazy... Hush, not a word about that. Maybe we'll talk about that later. Not that I would ever try to change your mind about anything you chose to think. A Mr. Smart guy like you who thinks for a living. All I ever did was pull you out of your wrecked car before you could freeze to death and splint your poor broken legs and give you medicine to ease your pain and take care of you and talk you out of a bad book you'd written and into the best one you ever wrote. And if that's crazy, take me to the loony bin. Oh, Annie, if only someone would, he thought. And before he could stop himself, he had snapped, You also cut off my fucking foot. Her hand flickered out quick and rocked his head over to one side with a thin spattering sound. Don't you use that F word around me, Annie said. I was raised better even if you weren't. You're lucky I didn't cut off your man gland. I thought of it, you know. He looked at her. His stomach felt like the inside of an ice maker. I know you did, Annie, he said softly. His eyes widened and for just a moment she looked both startled and guilty. Naughty Annie instead of nasty Annie. Listen to me. Listen closely, Paul. We're going to be alright if it gets dark before anyone comes to check on that fellow. It'll be full dark in an hour and a half. If someone comes sooner... She reached into the khaki bag again and brought out the trooper's .44. The cellar lights shone on the zigzagging lightning bolt the lawn boy's blade had chopped into the gun's barrel. If someone comes sooner, there's this, she said. For whoever comes, and then you, and then me. Once it was dark, she said. She was going to drive the police cruiser up to her laughing place. There was a lean-to beside the cabin where she could park it safely out of sight. She thought the only danger of being noticed would come on Route 9, but even there the risk would be small. She only had to drive 4 miles of it. Once she was off 9, the way into the hills was by little-traveled meadow-lined roads. Many fallen into casual disuse as grazing cattle this high up became a rarity. A few of these roads, she said, were still gated off. She and Ralph had obtained keys to them when they bought the property. They didn't have to ask. The owner of the land between the road and the cabin gave them the keys. This was called neighboring, she told Paul, managing to invest a pleasant word with unsuspected depths of nuance. Suspicion, contempt, bitter amusement. I would take you with me just to keep an eye on you, now that you've shown how untrustworthy you can be. But it wouldn't work. I could get you up there in the back of the police car, but getting you back down would be impossible. I'm gonna have to ride Ralph's trail bike. I'll probably fall off and break my cockadoodle neck. She laughed merrily to show what a joke on her that would be, but Paul did not join her. If that did happen, Annie, what would happen to me? You'll be fine, Paul, she said serenely. Gosh, you're such a worrywart. She walked over to one of the cellar windows and stood there for a moment, looking out, measuring the fall of the day. Paul watched her moodily. If she fell off her husband's bike or drove off one of those unpaved ridge roads, he did not actually believe he would be fine. What he actually believed was that he would die a dog's death down here. And when it was finally over, he would make a meal for the rats, which were even now undoubtedly watching these two unwelcome bipeds who had intruded upon their domain. There was a Krieg lock on the pantry door now, and a bolt on the bulkhead almost as thick as his wrist. The cellar windows as if reflecting Annie's paranoia. And there was nothing strange about that, he thought. Didn't all houses come after a while to reflect of their inhabitants? Were not much more than dirty gun silts, about 20 inches long by 14 wide. He didn't think he could have wriggled through one of those, even on his fittest day, which this wasn't. He might be able to break one and yell for help if someone showed up here before he starved to death, but that wasn't much comfort. The first twinges of pain slipped down his legs like poisoned water, and the want, his body yelling for Novril. It was the Gada, wasn't it? Sure it was. Annie came back and took the third bottle of Pepsi. "I'll bring down another couple of these before I go," she said. "Right now I need the sugar. You don't mind, do you?" "Absolutely not. My Pepsi is your Pepsi." She twisted the cap of the bottle and drank deeply. All the chug-a-lug, make you what you want to holler Heidi-ho. Who was that? Roger Miller, right? Funny, the stuff your mind coughed up. Hilarious. I'm going to put him in his car and drive it up to my laughing place. I'm going to take all of his things. I'll put the car in the shed up there and bury him in his, his scraps in the woods up there. He said nothing. He kept thinking about Bessie, bawling and bawling and bawling until she couldn't bawl anymore because she was dead. And another of those great axioms of life on the western slope was just this: dead cows don't bawl. I have a driveway chain. I'm going to use it. If the police come, it may raise suspicion. But I'd rather have them suspicious than have them drive up to the house and hear you making a big cockadoodle fuss. I thought of gagging you, but gags are dangerous. Especially if you're taking drugs that affect respiration. Or you might vomit. Or your sinuses might close up because it's so damp down here. If your sinuses closed up tight and you couldn't breathe through your mouth... She looked away, unplugged, as silent as one of the stones in the cellar wall, as empty as the first bottle of Pepsi she had drunk. Make what you want to holler Heidi-ho. And had Annie hollered Heidi-ho today? Bet your ass. Oh, brethren, Annie had yelled Heidi-ho until the whole yard was oogie. He laughed. She made no sign until she heard him. Then slowly she began to come back. She looked around at him, blinking. I'm going to stick a note through one of the links in the fence, she said, slowly regathering her thoughts. There's a town about 35 miles from here. It's called Steamboat Heaven. Isn't that a funny name for a town? They're having what they call the world's biggest flea market this week. They have it every summer. There's always lots of people there who sell ceramics. I'll write in my note that I'm there in Steamboat Heaven, looking at ceramics. I'll say I'm staying overnight. And if anyone asks me later where I stayed so they can check the register, I'll say there were no good ceramics, so I started back. Only I got tired. That's what I'll say. I'll say I pulled over to take a nap because I was afraid I might fall asleep behind the wheel. I'll say I only meant to take a short nap, but I was so tired from working around the place I slept all night. Paul was dismayed by the depth of this slyness. He suddenly realized that Annie was doing exactly what he could not. She was playing Can You in real life. Maybe, he thought, that's why she doesn't write books. She doesn't have to. I'll come back just as soon as I can, because policemen will come here, she said. The prospect did not seem to disturb Annie's weird serenity in the least. Although Paul could not believe that, in some part of her mind, she did not realize how close to the end of the game they had now come. I don't think they'll come tonight, except maybe to cruise by. But they will come. As soon as they know for sure he's really missing. They'll go all along his route looking for him and trying to find out where he stopped. You know, showing up. Don't you think so, Paul? Yes. I should be back before they come. If I start out on the bike at first light, I might even be able to make it back before noon. I should be able to beat them. Because if he started from Sidewinder, he would. He would have stopped at lots of places before he got here. By the time they come, you should be back in your own room, snug as a bug in a rug. I'm not going to tie you up or even gag you or anything like that, Paul. You can even peek when I go out to talk to them. Because it will be 2 next time, I think. At least 2. Don't you think so? Paul did. She nodded, satisfied. But I can handle 2 if I have to. She patted the khaki purse. I want you to remember that kid's gun while you're peeking, Paul. I want you to remember that it's going to be in here all the time. I'm talking to those police when they come tomorrow or the next day. The bag won't be zipped. It's alright for you to see them, but if they see you, Paul, either by accident or because you try something tomorrow like you did today, if that happens, I'm going to take the gun out of the bag and start shooting. You're already responsible for that kid's death. Bullshit, Paul said, knowing she would hurt him for it, but not caring. She didn't, though. She only smiled her serene maternal smile. Oh, you know, she said. I don't kid myself that you care. I don't kid myself about that at all. But you know. I don't kid myself I don't kid myself that you'd care about getting another 2 people killed if it would help you. But it wouldn't, Paul. Because if I had to do 2, I'll do 4. Them and us. And do you know what? I think you still care about your own skin. Not much, she said. I'll tell you the truth, Annie. Every day that passes, my skin feels more and more like something I want to get out of. Oh, I've heard that one before. But let them see you put one hand on their oogie old respirators. Then it's a different story. Yes. When they see that, they yell and cry and turn into a bunch of real brats. Not that you ever let that stop you, right, Annie? Anyway, she said, I just wanted you to know how things are. If you don't really care, yell your head off when they come. It's entirely up to you. Paul said nothing. When they come, I'll stand right out there in the driveway and say, yes, there was a state trooper that came by here. I'll say he came just when I was getting ready to leave for Steamboat Heaven to look at the ceramics. I'll say he showed me your picture. I'll say I hadn't seen you. Then one of them will ask me, this was last winter, Miss Wilkes. How could you be so positive? And I'll say, if Elvis Presley was still alive and you saw him last winter, would you remember seeing him? And he'll say, yes, probably so. But what does that have to do with the price of coffee in Borneo? And I'll say Paul Sheldon is my favorite writer. And I've seen his picture lots of times. I have to say that, Paul. Do you know why? He knew. Her slyness continued to astound him. He supposed it shouldn't not anymore, but it did. He remembered the caption below the picture of Annie in her detainment cell. The picture taken in the caesura between the end of the trial and the return of the jury. He remembered it word for word. In misery, not the dragon lady. Annie reads calmly as she waits for the verdict. So then, she continued, I'll say the policeman wrote it all down in his book and thanked me. I'll say I asked him in for a cup of coffee, even though I was in a hurry to be on my way, and they'll ask me why. I'll say he probably knew about my trouble before. I wanted to satisfy his mind that everything was on the up and up here. But he said no, he had to move along. So I asked if he'd like to take a cold Pepsi along with him because the day was so hot. And he said yes, thanks, that was very kind. She drained her second Pepsi and held the empty plastic bottle between her and him. Seen through the plastic, her eye was huge and wavering like the eye of a cyclops. The side of her head took on a ripply hydrocephalic bulge. I'm going to stop and put this bottle in the ditch about 2 miles up the road, she said. But first I'll put his fingers on it, of course. She smiled at him, a dry, spitless smile. Fingerprints, she said. They'll know he went past my house then. Or they'll think they do, and that's just as good, isn't it, Paul? His dismay deepened. So they'll go up the road and they won't find him. They'll just be gone. Like those swamis who toot their flutes until ropes come out of baskets and they climb the ropes and disappear. Poof. Poof, Paul said. It won't take them long to come back. I know that. After all, if they can't find any trace of him except that one bottle after here, they'll decide they better think some more about me. After all, I'm crazy, aren't I? All the papers said so. Nutty as a fruitcake. But they'll believe me at first. I don't think they'll actually want to come in and search the house. Not at first. They look into other places and try to think of other things before they come back. We'll have some time. Maybe as much as a week. She looked at him levelly. You're going to have to write faster, Paul, she said. Oh god, you can hear my voice crumbling. Crumbling in real time. Okay. I mean, I have to chance this like very last sip of tea, even though it's like filled with like ginger chunks and it's gonna like hurt my throat. Gotta swallow very carefully. Dark fell and no police came. Annie did not spend the time before it did with Paul, however. She wanted to re-glaze his bedroom window and pick up the paper clips and broken glass scattered on the lawn. When the police come tomorrow looking for their missing lamb, she said, we don't want them to see anything out of the ordinary, do we, Paul? Just let them look under the lawnmower, kiddo. Just let them look under there and they'll see plenty out in the ordinary. Or out of the ordinary. But no matter how hard he tried to make his vivid imagination work, he could not make it come up with a scenario in which would lead up to that. Do you wonder why I told you all of this, Paul? She asked before going upstairs to see what she could do with the window. Why I went into my plans for dealing with this in such great detail? No, he said wanly. Partly because I want you to know exactly what the stakes are, and exactly what you'll have to do to stay alive. I also wanted you to know that I'd end it right now. Except for the book. I still care about the book. She smiled. It was really a smile which was both radiant and strangely wistful. It really is the best misery story out of them all. And I do so much want to know how it all comes out. So do I, Annie, he said. Gosh, these hiccups. She looked at him, startled. Why, you know, don't you? When I start a book, I always think I know how things will turn out. But I never actually had one end exactly that way. It isn't even that surprising once you stop to think about it. Writing a book is a little like firing an ICBM, only it travels over time instead of space. The book time the characters spend living in the story, and the real time the novelist spends writing it all down. Having a novel end exactly the way you thought it would when you started out would be like shooting a Titan missile halfway around the world and having the payload drop through a basketball hoop. It looks good on paper, and there are people who build those things who tell you it was easy as pie, and even keep a straight face when they said it, but the odds are always against. Yes, Annie said. I see. I must have a pretty good navigation system built into the equipment, because I usually get close, and if you have enough high explosive packed into the nose cone, close is good enough. Right now I see two possible endings to the book. One is very sad. The other, while not your standard Hollywood happy ending, at least holds out some hope for the future. Annie looked alarmed, and suddenly thunderous. You're not thinking of killing her again, are you, Paul? He smiled a little. What would you do if I did, Annie? Kill me? That doesn't scare me a bit. I may not know what's going to happen to Misery, but I know what's going to happen to me. And you. I'll write the end, and you'll read, and then you'll write the end, won't you? The end of us. That's one I don't exactly have to guess at. Truth really isn't stranger than fiction, no matter what they say. Most times you know exactly how things are going to turn out. But I think I know which ending it's going to be. I'm about 80% sure. If it turns out that way, you'll like it. But even if it turns out the way I think, neither of us will know the actual details until I get them written down, will we? No, I suppose not. Do you remember what the old Greyhound bus ads used to say? Getting there is half the fun. Either way, it's almost over, isn't it? Yes, Paul said. Almost over. Before she brought him another Pepsi, a box. Before she left, she brought him another Pepsi, a box of Ritz crackers, sardines, cheese, and the bedpan. If you bring me my manuscript and one of those yellow legal pads, I'll work in longhand, he said. It'll pass the time. She considered, then shook her head regretfully. I wish you could, Paul. But that would mean leaving at least one light on, and I can't risk it. He thought of being left alone down here in the cellar, and felt panic flush his skin again. But just for a moment, then it went cold. He felt tiny hard goosebumps rising on his skin. He thought of the rats hiding in their holes and runs in the rock walls. Thought of them coming out when the cellar went dark. Thought of them smelling his helplessness, perhaps. Don't leave me in the dark, Annie. Please don't do that. I have to. If someone noticed a light in my cellar, they might stop to investigate. Driveway chain or no driveway chain. Note or no note. If I gave you a flashlight, you might try to signal with it. If I gave you a candle, you might try to burn the house down with it. You see how well I know you? He hardly dared mention the times he had gotten out of his room, because it always made her furious. Now his fear of being left alone down here in the dark drove him to it. If I had wanted to burn the house down, Annie, I could have done it long before this. Things were different then, she said shortly. I'm sorry you don't like being left in the dark. I'm sorry you have to be, but it's your own fault. So quit being a brat. I've got to go. If you feel like you need the injection, stick it in your leg. She looked at him. Or stick it up your ass. She started for the stairs. Cover the windows then, he yelled after her. Use some pieces of sheet or paint them black or Christ, Annie, the rats. The rats. She was on the third stair. She paused, looking at him from those dusty dime eyes. I haven't time to do any of those things, she said. And the rats won't bother you anyway. They may even recognize you for one of their own, Paul. They may adopt you. Annie laughed. She climbed the stairs, laughing harder and harder. There was a click as the lights went out, and Annie went on laughing as he told himself he wouldn't scream, wouldn't beg, that he was past all that. But the damp wildness of the shadows and the boom of her laughter were too much, and he screamed for her not to do this to him, not to leave him. But she only went on laughing, and there was a click as the door was shut, and her laughter was muted, but her laughter was still there. Her laughter was on the other side of the door where there was light, and then the other lock clicked, and then another door closed, and her laughter was even more muted, but still there. And another lock clicked, and a bolt slammed, and her laughter was going away. Her laughter went outside, and even after she had started the cruiser up, backed out, pulled the chain across her driveway, and driven away, he thought he could still hear her. He thought he could still hear her laughing and laughing and laughing. Oh, it's the final one. Fucking 2 more pages. Ah. The furnace was a dim bulk in the middle of the room. It looked like an octopus. He thought he would have been able to hear the chiming of the parlor clock if the night had been still, but a strong summer wind had blown up, as it so often did these nights, and there was only time spreading out forever. He could hear crickets singing just outside the house when the wind dropped. And then sometime later he heard the stealthy noises he had been afraid of. The low, momentary scuff and scurry of the rats. Only it wasn't the rats he was afraid of, was it? It was the trooper. His so fucking vivid imagination rarely gave him the horrors. But when it did, God help him. God help him once it was warmed up. It was not only warmed up now, it was hot and running on full choke. That there was no sense at all in what he was thinking made not a whit of difference in the dark. In the dark, rationality seemed stupid. Rationality seemed stupid, and logic a dream. In the dark, he thought with his skin. He kept seeing the trooper come back to life. Some sort of life out in the barn. Sitting up, the loose hay with which Annie had covered him falling to either side of him and into his lap. His face plowed into bloody senselessness by the mower's blade. Saw him crawling out of the barn and down the driveway to the bulkhead. The torn streamers of his uniform swinging and fluttering. Saw him melting magically through the bulkhead and reintegrating his corpse's body down here. Saw him crawling across the packed dirt floor, and the little noises Paul heard weren't rats, but the sound of his approach. And there was but a single thought in the cooling clay of the trooper's dead brain. You killed me. You opened your mouth and killed me. You threw an ashtray and killed me. You cockadoodle son of a bitch, you murdered my life. Once Paul felt the trooper's dead fingers slip tickling down his cheek, and he screamed loudly, jerking his legs and making them bellow. He brushed frantically at his face and knocked away not fingers, but a large spider. The movement ended the uneasy truce with the pain in his legs and the drug need in his nerves. But it also diffused his terror a little. His night vision was coming on strong now. He could see better, and that was a help. Not that there was much to look at. The furnace, the remains of a coal pile, a table with a bunch of shadowy cans and implements lying on it, and to his right, up away from where he was propped. What was that shape? The one next to the shelves? He knew that shape. Something about it made it a bad shape. It stood on 3 legs. Its top was rounded. It looked like one of Wells' death machines in the War of the Worlds, only in miniature. All puzzled over this, dozed a little, woke, looked again, and thought, of course, I should have known from the first. It's a death machine. And if anyone unearths a Martian, it's Annie fucking Wilkes. It's her barbecue pot. It's the crematorium where she made me burn fast cars. He shifted a little because his ass was going to sleep, and moaned. Pain in his legs, particularly in the bunched remains of his left knee, and pain in his pelvis as well. That probably meant he was in for a really bad night, because his pelvis had gotten pretty quiet over the last 2 months. He felt for the hypo, picked it up, then put it back. A very light dose, she had said. Best to save it for later then. He heard a light shuffle, scuffle, and looked quickly in the corner, expecting to see the trooper crawling toward him, one brown eye peering from the hash of his face. If not for you, I could be home watching TV now, with my hand on my wife's leg. No cop. A dim shape which was maybe just imagination, but was more likely a rat. Paul willed himself to relax. Oh, what a long night this was going to be. And with that, that's page 340. We got it up to chapter 22, baby. And I feel like my voice is like completely destroyed, but it's fine. Yeah, we're gonna definitely pick this up like sometime next week. I only have like 80 more pages, so like that's gonna be like the final one. So that's something. I have yeah. I don't even know how to like do my ending stuff. I have another stream tomorrow. We're gonna be playing IB. That was kind of by popular demand. I'm not sure like how much I'm gonna like it, but I couldn't really just like outright diss it. I felt like I feel like I at least needed to like give it a try. So that's just what we're gonna be doing tomorrow, and hopefully we'll be able to finish that like by the end of the month, or at least get like one of the endings. Cause I've heard there's like multiple endings, but I don't really like go for completionist stuff. I might just like pull up a video of all of them and just like we'll have them on stream, I guess. But yeah, that's a thing we're doing tomorrow, same time. So if you're interested, that's a thing we can do. And yeah, I guess that's about it. Like my voice is completely destroyed, and I really need to go to bed right about now because it's getting like more towards bedtime. So yeah, that's. I mean, how many people do we have right now? I'm pretty sure a lot of them must have left, but do we still have like how many we got here? 7? I mean, we could definitely like put it on to someone else. I just don't know. Ooh, oh, wait, we can rate him. That's a thing we can do. Oh, we're once again rating my good friend Savvy. He's playing like silly horror games, so you might enjoy it. I'm just gonna go ahead and do that right now. Nathaniel. Okay. So we're sending that off, and with that, I'll just head out for the night. So have a good morning, evening, afternoon, night, whatever it is, wherever you are. And I love you. Mwah!